Yeah, so welcome back to the Mob Archaeologists. We had a little hiatus there, took a few months off, but we just do what we've always done. We just pick up where we left off. We're excited to have Mark back on. This is sort of a continuation of our last Chicago episode, which went through the Aiuppa era. And I think we left off kind of at the end of Aiuppa's reign. Is that right? And so this is going to be Tony and Mark kind of carrying the show. 80's, 90's, maybe we'll even go a little later, that era of Chicago. So, Tony, do you want to take it from there? Lead us in?
Yeah, we're excited to be back. It's summer and, life, of course, happens. And so we've been, the show's been on a sort of pause just for the past, month or two. The last two episodes that we did, which was the Aiuppa era Chicago episode and the Philly episode, that Eric and Angelo did, had our highest viewership to date, and we're very excited about that. So we've gotten a lot of great feedback. We always get lots of really interesting comments also, which we appreciate. And you'll note that we, some of us will try to answer whenever we're able to when people post questions or comments and so forth, right? As long as they're constructive and respectful, which almost everybody is, right? We have a great audience. So we're very excited to be back. I think this is something that seems that the Chicago and Philly episodes always get a lot of attention, right? They're interesting families, very well-known families, sort of in the popular media, even and amongst mob enthusiasts. But there's different levels of good or poor information that kind of filter out to the public about these things. And especially with Chicago, our general sort of mantra has been that until recently, there has been very little information based on actual member or well-placed associate sources when it comes to the Chicago family, going back for decades, right? So most of what people have had access to in terms of materials and resources on this has been filtered through outsider perspectives, who often filled in the blanks or even sometimes made up things to sort of explain what was happening. Unlike families like in New York, for example, and in some other cities where there have been a lot of insider sources, right? We've had bosses testify on the stand and so forth, and other administration members, where you had Balachi in 1963, right? Chicago never had this. But now we're getting into an era with the post-Aiuppa Cerrone administrations from 1986 on, where we actually, for the first time, have access to two member sources, right? As well as some other, different materials and different types of evidence we kind of use to triangulate when we still have a lot of questions. Because even with those two member sources, there's a lot of gaps, right? There's still a lot of questions. But Mark, we're very excited to have on. Mark and I both, we're interested in other families, but I think we can say that we both focus our research efforts primarily on the Chicago family, right? And, we're often in dialogue about these things. Eric is also very interested in this, even though he takes an interest in a lot of different families, right? So this is going to be an interesting show, right? And Mark, we have two member sources that can help us to sort of kind of guide our interpretation, right? And you have spent years doing your best to dig up what's available in terms of FBI reports, documents from trials, and other forms of evidence, such as they are. They still leave us with a lot of gaps, right? They don't answer all the questions we'd like to answer. But I think through pulling together different sources and dialogue, which is what we do normally when we're not on the show, is we talk to each other and we share things that we find, right?
Yeah, and the two member sources that we have are Jerry Scarpelli, who was made in 1988 and committed suicide in 1989, and really left very little evidence about the actual process of becoming a made member or making ceremony or LCN structure as it is, as opposed to Nick Calabrese, who testified in great extent to that. But the difference was that Nick Calabrese testified in a major federal trial as opposed to Scarpelli, who agreed to provide information for the benefit of a 302.
Yep.
And then reneged on his testimony, reneged on his information, basically, and then decided to commit suicide a year later. So we have Nick Calabrese, who was made a member in 1983, and he was able to provide information on a lot of the time period that's in question now. So in about May of 1986 was when Aiuppa, Cerrone, Angelo LaPietra, and Joey Lombardo, who was actually already in prison for a few years at that point, were convicted of skimming money and hidden ownership in Las Vegas casinos. So May of 86 was when they were convicted. They were imprisoned at that time. I don't believe they were sentenced until 87, but they were in prison. So we could safely say that about May of 86 that they had determined who were going to be their successors, because essentially they knew they were going to be in prison for at least some period of time in May of 86. So Aiuppa, Cerrone, and Angelo LaPietra, who was capo of the Chinatown crew at the time in May of 86, were convicted and imprisoned. Aiuppa was the boss, Cerrone was the underboss, and LaPietra was capo of the Chinatown crew. So in their stead, as best as we can gather, Aiuppa appointed Sam Carlisi to be the next boss of the outfit. As near as we can gather, John DiFronzo was underboss of the outfit, and Angelo LaPietra appointed his brother James LaPietra to be acting capo of the Chinatown crew while he was in prison. So I believe there's some evidence from Joe Fosco, though, that DiFronzo and Willie Massino actually shared the underboss duties for a period of time, a very brief period of time. But if I remember correctly, and Tony, you may remember, Massino had upset somebody at a meeting, and very soon after that, DiFronzo was the sole underboss of the outfit at that point. But I do remember Joe Fosco, who runs the American News Post and was affiliated with the outfit for a period of time in the late 80s, early 90s, did say that Willie Massino was briefly for a time the underboss of the outfit.
Yeah, Joe Fosco personally knew Willie Massino in the later years of his life. I mean, Joe Fosco was related to Mondo Fosco, was his father. He had people like Romeo Nappi that were part of his extended family, and also as a sort of associate level person, knew a lot of different people affiliated with the Chicago outfit. So, and he specifically spent time with Willie Massino in his later years. So he's a source that that we take seriously. But like anything else, we try to fit it together with what we already know, knowing that what we have access to in terms of evidence is only a small part of it. So if we go back to Scarpelli, so yes, Scarpelli is debriefed by the FBI. We have access to the 302s, right? They have some redactions, but most of it is legible, right? As Mark already mentioned, it doesn't really tell us a lot, but it does clear up a couple of things that are really important, and which Nick Calabrese then, of course, confirms and sheds more light on, I think, right? So July of 1988, he's debriefed in the Metropolitan Correction Center in downtown Chicago, and he had flipped because an associate of the Cicero group, of the Ferriola crew, Jimmy Duke Bazile, had flipped and had made tapes of Scarpelli, which were used to compel Scarpelli to agree to cooperate. Because I think he told the FBI, "Boy, you guys are slick. You really got me here," right? And yeah, as Mark noted, Scarpelli had been a notorious killer and enforcer for Joe Ferriola, going back to before Ferriola was a captain, when he was a soldier under Turk Torello in the 70s. He had a sort of sub crew called the Wild Bunch, colloquially, right, referring to like cowboys, sort of very, very notorious group of people, including guys like Harry Alamon, Scarpelli, Butchie Petroselli, Tony Borsellino, right, and Louis Marino, right. These guys were associates at this time of the Cicero group, right. And so Scarpelli isn't made. So again, this often happens in Chicago as well as some other families, especially outside of New York, where the membership, the formal actual membership of the Mafia, is small compared to these large New York families. Guys could be active for decades. It could be Italian, could qualify for membership and could not be proposed or made in many cases, right? So Scarpelli isn't made until just a couple months before he flips. What he does tell the feds that's important is he tells the feds that Aiuppa was boss, Aiuppa was succeeded by Sam Carlisi, right? And that Joe Ferriola, he thought probably, this is putting quotes, this is a direct quotation from Scarpelli. Scarpelli says that Ferriola was probably the underboss as of 1988, but that Ferriola was in very poor health. Ferriola had a heart transplant. He's the only member of the Mafia, as far as I know, who ever had a heart transplant. If it happened in Sicily, maybe I'm not aware of it, but as far as I know, in the U.S., like I said before, they gave him a heart because he didn't have one to begin with, right? He was don't mean anything to the family or anything, but he was known as a very tough guy, right? And he received a heart transplant, I believe, at the Mayo Clinic. He was very, very ill and was not, according to Scarpelli, wasn't really seeing anybody. Scarpelli said he hadn't had any sit-downs or meetings with Ferriola, and that his boss at this point was Rocky and Police. It's another example of a guy the feds thought he was made back in the 60s. Rocky and Police actually wasn't inducted until 1983. We know that because Nick Calabrese was inducted with him and later testified about it, right? So whether Ferriola was the underboss, whether he was the acting underboss, but still official captain of the Cicero crew, or the Torello Buccieri crew. Some people call it Taylor Street, some people call it Cicero, right? Because they had operations in both of those areas. By 1988, Police was either the official captain of that crew or the acting captain. In 1989, Ferriola dies. This is important because you'll still see people, I can't fault them for it, because law enforcement and like the press put this out during the 80s, that Ferriola had succeeded Aiuppa as boss of the Chicago outfit. And we have two main member sources, the only two that we have for this period, both concur that he was not. And Ferriola, Scarpelli's not even sure that Ferriola was the underboss, right? He thought he probably was. So it could be that he was, and maybe the position wasn't filled. These positions aren't always filled. They can go years without being filled. They can have guys serving in an acting capacity or an interim capacity, right? That's important to keep in mind. These things don't get filled as soon as someone goes to prison or dies or something, right?
Yeah.
So, but we know for a fact that Carlisi did succeed Aiuppa as boss as of 1986 or 1987. So by the time that Scarpelli is made, right, Ferriola appears to basically be inactive because of serious health problems. And Ferriola wasn't present in the 1983 ceremony, and Nick Calabrese even thought he wasn't a captain, which we kind of brought up, I think, before, right? Scarpelli seems to confirm that he was a captain, even though he doesn't use that term. He just says he was his boss, and then that as of 88, Police was his boss.
Yeah.
Where do you think it comes from Ferriola was the boss? Because I've seen that in different places. I ask this question a lot because you'll see these claims made that are just kind of accepted. And I'm like, where does that come from? Was it in the newspapers? Was it in a book? Is there some source that I'm unaware of, a legitimate source?
Papers. I can tell he was in the Chicago papers. And I think that some, there might have been sources that the FBI had that were not member sources that believed he was. The FBI had associates, and even guys who weren't really associates, but were like hangers-on or crooks, right? So have you seen any sources specifically, Mark, that believe that Ferriola succeeded Aiuppa as boss?
None that come to mind immediately, but we do know by 88, Scarpelli was the one that did say that Carlisi had succeeded Aiuppa as boss of the outfit. Also, later on in 91 or 92, we had Lenny Patrick, who said that Carlisi also succeeded Aiuppa. And Lenny Patrick, even though he wasn't made, Lenny Patrick went back, 40 years in the outfit as a high-placed associate.
Yep.
So he would have been well aware who was the boss of the outfit at that point. And then, of course, later on, we had Calabrese, who confirmed that it was, in fact, Carlisi who had succeeded Aiuppa as boss of the outfit.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it's just that there were no good sources that were able to confirm that Carlisi had succeeded Aiuppa as boss of the outfit. At least no good member sources, that is. So,
yeah, Ferriola was known since like the 60s and 70s as a pretty prominent guy. He was a rough guy. His crew, even before he was a captain, his sort of, crew, his sub crew, right? The Wild Bunch guys and guys, affiliated with them. These were guys who were associates under him when he was a soldier. These guys were tasked with all sorts of hits. They had, lucrative extortion and juice collection operations going on. They were running all over Chicagoland, essentially, committing acts of violence. They were, very notorious people, right? Known in the press, known even by the general public and so forth, right? So, I mean, Ferriola was a very high profile guy, right? Even when he was a soldier. We actually just discussed this recently, but Mark, you sent me a family tree, not a mafia family, right? Even though, his family was involved with the mafia, right? But of the Carlisi family, which, they go back to Cani Gatti and Agrigento.
Mhm.
This before, but we have reason to suspect that Carlisi's father, Joe Carlisi, could well have been a member. He may have been a member of the Buffalo family that transferred to Chicago, because by the late 20s, he had apparently been involved or was suspected of a murder in Buffalo. The family had already moved back and forth between upstate New York and Chicago after they immigrated from Sicily. His father was in Cicero in the 1920s and 30s and was, reputed to be the head of a bootlegging ring. And, was a guy direct from Sicily who probably was, again, a member of the Buffalo family that transferred to Chicago. It's a good bet. If he wasn't a member, at least an associate, he was definitely involved.
You remember,
But
too,
in 1986, the FBI apparently still believed that Sam Carlisi in Chicago was an associate. They have him denoted as an associate on this document we were just looking at. So
Yeah.
they didn't even know the year he became boss. It appears at least the FBI wasn't even aware necessarily he was a member.
Yeah.
In the midst of it.
Well,
How poor information is.
yeah, and the FBI also didn't know that the Melrose Park crew was its own street crew. The Elmwood Park crew was its own street crew. They just assumed it was the five, quote unquote traditional street crews. You had Cicero, you had Northside, you had Chinatown, Grand Avenue, and Chicago Heights.
Yep.
Those were the ones that Chicago had pegged as the street crews, and it really didn't change until '88.
Yep.
I believe Scarpelli was the one who flipped and told him about there actually being 7 street crews. So,
Yep.
Carlisi was held on there as an associate until, presumably Scarpelli was able to confirm that he was a member. So it is interesting to note that we do have a couple of FBI membership lists. One was available from 1985 and one was available in 1993.
Yeah.
Now the 85 one, it doesn't have Carlisi on it. It doesn't have DiFronzo on it. It doesn't have several guys that we know were made at that point.
Yeah.
But it does have several guys. It has the 5 capos of those crews that I just mentioned earlier. It has the boss and the underboss, correct. It has the consiglieri as Tony Accardo, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it does have several names on there and confirmed names of guys that were maybe legacy guys left over from the 60s, 70s. I'm thinking guys like Louis DeRiggi, Anthony Sirignani, Romy Nappi, I think, was on the 85 list.
Yeah.
So,
right.
And unfortunately, the 85 list is the one that we have unredacted, but the later on the 93 list, I think, is only available in redacted format. So you kind of have to fill in the blanks, but I do believe Carlisi does show up as unredacted on the 93 list. So,
well, by that point, he stood up because he had been convicted in '93, right? Or
So it makes it a little bit easier. Like if you're head of a street crew, like it's going to be presumed that you're a made member of Chicago at that point. So
we know that when we say head of a street crew, that's how law enforcement and like the media in Chicago tend to refer to like an official decina of the mafia.
Yeah.
And they often refer to the captains or the capodicini as street bosses.
Yeah.
But then we get Nick Calabrese in his testimony years later doesn't use the term street boss. He refers to them as capo or captain.
Yeah.
Right. Again, it's one of the, if they're synonymous, one is like a sort of outsider term, one is an insider term. But, we'll get people sometimes watch the show and they'll be like, they never said capo or capodicino in Chicago. And it's like, well, we have wiretaps and testimony where they attest that they did say that. The problem is a lot of the information that came out wasn't coming from member sources. Right.
An interesting detail about Carlisi's background that needs to be mentioned is that his brother, Roy, was a capodicina in the Buffalo family, longtime capodicina. Yep. And according to Ron Fino, whose father, Joe Fino, was an acting boss in Buffalo and close to Carlisi, he said that Roy Carlisi was actually made in Chicago before he moved to Buffalo. So he would have been a transfer. And no doubt Ron Fino got that from his father.
Yep.
And then he also said that, I think we talked about this in the Aiuppa episode, but Joey Aiuppa had a relationship to Fino and likely Roy Carlisi. Yep. There's a report from the late 70s that even says Roy Carlisi had become underboss in the years after Magadino stepped down. So, people have this idea that Chicago kind of operated in a vacuum. The sort of connections we see all around the country didn't apply. There you go. At the same time, high-ranking Chicago member, high-ranking Buffalo member, brothers. Roy Carlisi, I think we can, take it with some level of confidence that he was made in Chicago.
Yeah.
He said, in fact, that he was the youngest member in Chicago before he left for Buffalo.
Yeah, under Capone, right? That's what Ron Fino later said in his book, right? Yeah, and in the early 1930s, I believe, is when Roy Carlisi, Rosario, they call him Roy, moved to Buffalo. And like I said earlier, after immigrating from Agrigento in Sicily, their family bounced around between New York State and Chicago. And later on, because of a murder rap in Buffalo, Giuseppe Carlisi takes his family back to Chicago and stay there. So then we should also mention that Alphonse Al Tornabini, who was the first cousin of Sam Carlisi, right, is a sort of longtime sleeper member in Chicago. He's not mentioned in any of these lists. He'll come up a little bit later because he becomes part of the administration in Chicago in the years after this, right? He operates a pizzeria, which is why they call him Al the Pizza Man also, right? He operates a pizzeria in suburban Stickney next to Cicero. Somebody who I think with law enforcement was aware he had some connections, but they had no idea he was a member. He's a member of the same Melrose Park crew, the Aiuppa Carlisi crew, right? And he's first cousins of Roy and Sam Carlisi. And I was able to find out that it looks like he was also first cousins of another guy named Al Tornabini, right? Also named Alfonso Tornabini, who was born in Agrigento and was apparently a captain, as far as we know, was a captain in the Gambino family in New York.
Sam Tornabini. He was an Appalachian.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There you go. Sam Tornabini. That's right. Yeah. He's kind of an obscure member of the Gambino family, but was it Valachi or somebody else identified him as a member, right?
Yeah, he gets sometimes mislabeled a Colombo member because he worked for Joe Magliocco's beer company, but he was a Gambino member.
Yeah, he was a relative. Also, he's a relative of the Al Tornabini in Chicago, right? These are all families that go back to the same part of Eastern Agrigento, and some of them go to New York, some of them go to Chicago, like people did when they immigrated, right? But this is
the Gambino family had a large faction from Canacotti. They were part of a fraternal society. There was an early captain, Nicola Gentile talks about, Trupia. He was from there, I believe. Another Carlisi cousin was a guy named Joe Frisco Gentile, who was actually a step cousin, and he was murdered in the 60s. And Roy Carlisi was reported telling Stefano Magadino, I have to go back to Chicago. My cousin, Joe Gentile, just got killed, kind of thing. He doesn't say what he was going to do, like what his involvement was. But yeah, he was the son of Giuseppe Carlisi's stepbrother. So that's interesting that a Carlisi cousin was murdered in the 60s and Roy Carlisi went to Chicago because of it. Why he was killed, no idea.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, what Chicago did in terms of making a beat or having to sit down over it. But I mean, at this point in the 1960s, both Chicago and Buffalo had seats on the commission. These are two very powerful families, right, at the national level, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, this is important to give you sort of the background on who this person is, who, as of 1985, 1986, the feds apparently are not even aware that he's a member, let alone that he was a captain of the crew that Aiuppa had previously helmed before he became boss, sometime around 1975, like we discussed before, right?
Yeah.
And there's multiple familial connections to the Mafia in Chicago and New York State. And presumably the family connected to the Mafia going back to Canicotti and
And in addition to Roy, Sam also had two other brothers who were involved in the outfit. Now, to what extent, we don't know. They could have been members. They were listed on the 60s and 70s lists. But as you know, some of those lists had dubious sources for membership citations.
Yeah.
But he had another brother named Carmine Carlisi and another brother named Alphonse Carlisi. And I believe that at least Carmine Carlisi, who confusingly enough was apparently also nicknamed Black Sam, which was Sam Carlisi's nickname. I don't know whether they conflated the two or not, but He also had a brother named named Carmine Carlisi and Alphonse Carlisi, and I believe at least Carmine Carlisi was listed as a member in the 60s or 70s list, one of those older lists.
Could have been the 73 list where and in that case we don't even know who the sources are for some of the because they're redacted. The 68 list that the FBI put out, we've been able to confirm who most of the sources are, and a lot of them, some of them aren't even actually members as far as we know. So it's fraught, right?
And I think Carmine or Carmen, he died, I believe, in the mid 70s, and Alphonse was he didn't die until the late 80s. I'm going to say maybe 87 or 88.
That sounds
So
older than him. He was
I don't know the extent of his involvement. I don't remember if he was on one of the older lists. He certainly wasn't on the 85 or the 93 list as a made member. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't involved. It's just that, he wasn't involved. He wasn't listed on either one of those membership lists from either 85 or 93. I don't remember if he's on one of those older 73 or 65 lists or 68 lists, whatever those older lists were listed.
I don't think he might. There was a 67 and a 68 list that were put out, but essentially the same list, just put out in different documents.
Yeah. Now I know Carmine wasn't listed on at least one of those lists. So, at least by older sources, he was considered to be a member.
They had Rocky and Felice on there too. Like I said, Rocky.
Yeah, true. And they also had the 73 list. Also had Frank Calabrese on there as well. And we also know that he wasn't made until 83. So
10 years.
There are definitely some mistakes on those older FBI lists simply because their source information was not nearly as good as it was.
Yep.
And I don't even want to say it was great in 85 or 86, considering they didn't have Carlisi is a member on there. So their source information probably wasn't really that great until Scarpelli flipped, and especially until Calabrese flipped in 2002. So there's
Tony, you could elaborate on this, but just to establish like the roots of the Carlisis in the Chicago family, I believe it was around 1930, wasn't it, that Giuseppe Carlisi, I believe Roy, and then Joe Frisco Gentile's father were arrested in a bootlegging ring with the Chicago boss, Salvatore Loverde. That's correct, right?
Well, it was a massive bootlegging ring under the guy that was then the boss of the Chicago family, Salvatore Toto Loverde, right? He was from the city of Palermo and was described by Mafia member Nick Gentile as the official boss of Chicago, even though by this time Capone, who was technically a member of the Masseria Genovese family, was essentially the real power, right? He hadn't yet ascended to boss yet, right? That would come a little bit later under Salvatore Maranzano. But yeah, there was a huge bootlegging ring that involved Toto Loverde, and it involved a guy named Cipriano Argento, who was also from Canicattì, who was presumably a member of the Chicago family, based out of the Chinatown area. And he was later murdered in the 1930s by Jim DeGeorge, who was a Chicago captain. If not at that time, he was by the 1940s, right? So another one of these kind of early Chicago figures that are sort of secondhand names to us because we've done research on them, but very little in the public is known about these people. So there's a context to Paisani, people from their same hometown, right, having involvement or activity with the Mafia, both in Chicago as well as in Western New York, in the Buffalo area. These are areas where a lot of people from Eastern Agrigento settled, as well as in Brooklyn and other parts of New York City. And that ring was huge, and it involved a bunch of illegal stills operating in both Illinois and Cicero and in Chicago and in up in Racine and Kenosha, Wisconsin. And it had links to Buffalo also. So it was a big deal. Yeah.
My understanding right then that Sam Carlisi isn't even on membership lists basically until he becomes the boss.
He wasn't on the 85 membership list. The only membership list that the membership list that's immediately succeeds 85 was 93, and he was on that list. But as Tony already mentioned, he had already been convicted as being head of the Melrose Park crew and boss of the outfit by that point. So I'm sure they had membership lists that were released as part of FBI files in those intervening 8 years, but he definitely wasn't listed on there in 85. So
Yeah.
And neither was DiFronzo for that matter. And several other guys that were also made in that '83 ceremony that Calabrese was a part of were also not on that '85 list. So that just shows you that the membership sources for that period of time were not very good. So
yeah, so we think that by 1989, right, which is in 1989, Carlisi goes to Florida, right, and starts spending a lot of time at his Florida home, right, and also in March of 1989, I believe, is when Joe Ferriola, who we mentioned may have been either the underboss or the acting underboss, according to Scarpelli, right? That's when he dies and had been very, very, very ill before that, right? To the point that he needed a heart transplant, so he wasn't really active, right? And at that point, we think that that's probably when Johnny DiFronzo, who Mark just brought up, most likely became underboss. And as far as we know, he had succeeded Jackie Cerrone in the 1970s as capo of the Elmwood Park crew.
yeah,
Very important, crew in the Chicago Mafia, right? And and I think that the information that Joe Fosco has discussed would probably concur with that at least, right?
yeah. And it should be noted that once Jackie Cerrone went to prison for the gambling conviction, and I believe it was 1970 was when he was convicted and actually sent to prison.
Right.
It was Joe Gagliano who I think briefly took control of over the Elmwood Park crew, and he died very soon after that. In 1971, I believe Joe Gagliano died. And there are FBI files that say that John DiFronzo took over the quote unquote juice or extortionate credit transaction crew of the Elmwood Park, which I don't think they actually considered it to be a street crew at that point. They considered it just an extortion crew. But they did say that John DiFronzo succeeded Joe Gagliano. So at least there's some evidence that we have that DiFronzo succeeded Gagliano in some capacity in the early 70s once Gagliano died.
Yeah.
There's some newspaper sources in about 89 or 90 that do say that Carlisi spending more and more time in Florida. As we also knew at that point, Ferriola dies in March of '89. And I believe some of those same newspaper sources, most of them out of the Tribune, do say that DiFronzo has succeeded to as at least the street boss of the outfit by that point, if not the acting boss, even though I think the two terms at that point are interchangeable.
Yeah. Street boss is a fuzzy term, right? And people use it a lot, and even guys in life use it, right? The problem is with Chicago, this is true in other families. In Chicago, it's often used interchangeably 3 different ways, and people don't even seem to be aware of the fact that these actually denote fundamentally different positions in the organization. Sometimes people use it to mean an acting boss, right? Which would be the formal way you refer to that, somebody that serves in an acting position as the boss of the family because the other boss, another boss hasn't been appointed yet. Boss is incapacitated or in prison or so forth, right? He's serving as essentially as a substitute for the boss, right? You can have it as a sort of liaison between the administration, the boss, and the underboss, and the other captains. So in some cases, people might use it to refer to a captain that's used to relay orders to the other captains, to sort of insulate the boss or the underboss from law enforcement scrutiny, right? And then in Chicago, they also use law enforcement and the press historically use street boss to denote a cappuccino or a captain of a crew. So it becomes very difficult because the Chicago Tribune may print the word street boss over the decades many different times and be referring to different things, right? But I think that we can say that it's possible because Jackie Cerrone had been the underboss under Aiuppa right before he went down in the strongman case. It's possible that DiFronzo could have succeeded Cerrone either as either as an official or acting underboss, and Scarpelli might not have been aware of it because he'd only been a member for a very short period before he flipped. It's possible that Ferriola was, and that as of 1989, that Johnny DiFronzo succeeded him, again, whether as acting or official underboss, right? Or it's possible that position went unfilled for years. And, it might have just appeared that way because I don't think that Scarpelli, again, he thought that Ferriola probably was the underboss. I don't believe that Nick Calabrese denoted the underboss during that period, right?
I think he had the underboss was Cerrone was the only name he specifically mentioned as the underboss or number two.
When
I
he
think
was made in '83.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, when he was made in '83. After that, he didn't denote acting bosses or underbosses, right?
Yeah, he had he had listed as boss during that period of time that the racketeering indictment encompassed was, I believe he had Accardo and then Aiuppa and then Carlisi and then Monteleone, if I'm not mistaken.
100%. July 2007, over I think like July 16th through 18th, I think he gave testimony. Maybe it was 4 days, but they asked him a couple different times. Different things. They asked him about murders. They also asked him about the actual structural organization of the mafia in Chicago. And he said absolutely, very clearly, he said that when he was made, Accardo was a former boss. We have other evidence the FBI had denoted Accardo as a consigliere, right? We're talking about by 1983, right, when Aiuppa was officially his boss already, right? And then at that point, Cerrone was the underboss, which we have other sources to support that also. That none of this is controversial, right?
Yeah.
He said to Carlisi, just as Scarpelli and Lenny Patrick also said that Carlisi succeeded Aiuppa as boss, and then Calabrese said that Johnny Apes Monteleone, succeeded Carlisi. I think we'll get into that because there's a way that some people might say, well, that doesn't make sense because I always heard Johnny DiFronzo was boss.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And real quick, I just want to touch on Accardo as the consigliere because I think there's a feeling with people who study most of the New York families, the East Coast families, that the consigliere is sort of the number three. And I think that's a misnomer. And Eric, you may be able to touch on this a little bit more, where the consigliere is almost more of like an equal to the boss, as opposed to just number three position within the organization. Isn't that correct? So Accardo as consigliere is more of, a respected position and somebody who can mediate and settle disputes and offer input on decisions, as opposed to just somebody who's the number three who may, have less of an input as opposed to, say, the boss or the underboss. So
yeah, people have an idea that the consigliere is sort of like a stepping stone on the way to becoming boss. Like you become consigliere, then underboss, then boss, when it really traditionally at least didn't work that way. Consigliere was often an elected position by the membership. And Megadino was recorded saying he didn't have a consigliere in his family because it meant two voices at the top of the family. He felt if the boss was elected unanimously, which it's supposed to be, that having this other guy who has an equal voice is sort of undermines the purpose of a boss. And we see examples of that around the country. We have examples of consigliere who are, more subordinate to the boss, old guys who just kind of, give advice, that kind of thing. But we have many examples too, though, where it's an incredibly powerful member. We have Philadelphia, where the consigliere was basically the boss of his own faction. We have references to Joe Ferriola planning to step down and become consigliere, which would be kind of like Chicago, where former boss takes that role. And then we also have the fact that we know Chicago had a concilio, which was a council, and these councils had an elected chairman, which is a term we've heard in Chicago. And the chairman oversaw the council, which included the boss. He sort of presided over this. And that seems to be the case in Chicago, where they had an elected chairman. We know in San Jose, Stefano Zoccoli was the chairman, and he had the power to go to New York and ask that the boss be taken down. He had equal power, if not more, in some ways. I think that's maybe a better way of looking at it. It's not necessarily like he had more power than the boss. He had different powers, if that makes sense.
It's important. Yeah, like Antonino Calderoni, who was a member of the Mafia family in Catania, Sicily, that flipped and became a witness for the government there, right, described if I recall, the consigliere, as he knew it, as being a sort of elder of the family, right, like a respected older member, right. So in Chicago, that seems to have been the pattern, right. That the consigliere seems to, in most, if not all cases, from what we understand, to probably have been the chairman of a council that was formed by the boss, the underboss, the official consigliere or chairman, as well as some powerful captains and maybe a soldier, right, which is possible in some of these councils, right. it seems like the chairman who served as the official consigliere was typically a former boss. We believe that Paul Rica, who had been a boss, was the chairman of the council during the 60s. We went into detail about this in the previous episode, but after Giancana leaves the country, we have member sources, right? The FBI had that weren't available until recently that that confirmed that Accardo and Rica were acting bosses in Giancana's absence. After Rica dies, Accardo continues on as the sole acting boss, and then after Aiuppa around 1975, because it becomes installed as the official boss, which again is confirmed by member sources, Accardo then appears to become a consigliere again. Right, so he was probably consigliere the whole time, serving as acting boss until they could appoint, a new official boss.
Interesting.
Typically doesn't have soldiers answering to him, and isn't actually part of the formal chain of command. It's sort of a counterbalance to the power of the boss. And the idea is, instead of being a number three under the boss and the underboss, right, is you have a person that's able to sort of serve as a counterweight again to the dictatorial power.
Yeah.
Of the boss. And for this reason, reports to say Accardo does not serve in a day-to-day acting capacity, right, where Aiuppa does. This is really important, right? So Accardo is somebody that's very important. He plays a sort of active role at some level in the administration of the family, but he's not the one who ultimately is issuing orders. He's not in charge of the chain of command, which is exactly what we would expect from a former boss who serves as consigliere. Right.
Well, Bill Bonanno says in his last book that traditionally the consigliere would serve as acting boss.
Yeah.
When it comes to the family councils in San Jose, there's a report where Stefano Zaccoli, who is the chairman of the council, probably the official consigliere, he and another council member served as dual acting bosses when Joe Cerrito was out of town. So that's kind of like what we see with Accardo and Rica stepping up. I know we covered the Accardo-Rica council stuff before, but some of this stuff we have to look at into the later decades, because we don't have answers to the questions. We don't have that smoking gun Chicago source who says yes, Tony Accardo was the consigliere. What we do have is numerous reports from the FBI spanning decades where he's identified with that rank. You can say we're just shoehorning him in, but he certainly fits some of the role that we know the consigliere played. I don't think that it's that audacious to say he might have been the consigliere, and we have reason to think that very well could have been the case.
Yeah, I mean he was listed as the consigliere in a couple of in some membership lists and in other files. He was listed specifically, and they use that language as consigliere. So it certainly isn't out of the realm of possibility that he was the actual consigliere. Maybe he held more weight because of the status that he had held in the family in previous years and decades. I can't attest to that, but he was certainly described as somebody who held some type of advisory capacity within the family. And typically when you see his name mentioned in files in the 80s and 90s, either that he held some type of advisory capacity or that he was the consigliere. So now we don't have Scarpelli specifically saying he was consigliere. We don't really have anything that's available to the public now where Nick Calabrese says he was consigliere, but I think it's within reason to assume that he was in a role that was, if not the consigliere, something that's very close to the consigliere within Chicago.
We do have, in Jimmy Fradiano's book, he says he was told by Johnny Roselli that Accardo was acting as consigliere. So that's a member source using that word, saying he was told by Roselli, a Chicago member. We know Fradiano was very close to Chicago members. So that's the closest thing we have. That is a member source. It's just not a Chicago member.
Angelo Leonardo, who was the underboss of the Cleveland outfit, and was his father, Joe Leonardo, had been boss of that family before he was murdered in the late 1920s. Angelo Leonardo flipped right in the early 80s, and he said, as of I believe 1984, when his information was still current, that he understood that Accardo was, as he put it, the head of the Chicago Commission, which is interesting because earlier in 1969, LA member Frank Bonpensero told the FBI that Chicago has a consiglio, right, a council, and that it functions as a commissione, a commission for the family. So it's interesting that later on, Leonardo, who was a member of a different family and didn't report to Chicago. Chicago wasn't their commission representative. They reported to the Genovese family, right? But he was aware of Accardo as holding the position of head of the Chicago Commission.
And I think doesn't Leonardo also say Accardo was the boss?
Yeah, he does, but so that's an interesting thing also, right? That's directly contradicted by the Chicago member sources we have, which is, again, the importance of not just taking one source at face value, but trying to triangulate what we have. Because we have two member sources, and they both concur that Accardo was not boss. I mean, Scarpelli doesn't mention Accardo at all. And Calabrese just says that Accardo, as of the time he was made in 1983, was a former boss. Now, but under cross-examination, I believe Calabrese also said he really did not understand how things worked at the level above captain. Because he was a soldier, he was not privy to any of that. He didn't really understand exactly how the chain of command and how orders came down from the administration. So he knew that the captains interfaced with an administration above them, right? Which he understood consisted of a boss and an underboss at least. But he didn't really. He said, "I wasn't part of any of that." And interesting, the 2005 indictments that the federal government put out, when they dropped the indictment, like the actual case came out for family secrets, it's like a 40-page document or something, and they have a sort of kind of a summary of the Chicago family, right? And they say that it has boss, underboss, consiglieri, and capos, right? They're the heads of crews, and then soldiers underneath them, right? And associates. Yeah. Same structure as any other mafia family. And they describe the consiglieri as like a senior advisor, to the administration. So they were getting this from somebody, and they put this out in the indictment. But if we had a captain or an administration member that had testified, in the family secrets case, we may have gotten a lot more details about how these things work. There was a lot of internal security and insulation within the organization. Right? Yeah. We discussed before, Calabrese wasn't even sure if Louis Eboli was a captain or not.
Yeah.
Last thing I want to add on that is we have the testimony of Special Agent in Charge Haggerty of the Chicago FBI office, who testified in the 1980s that the boss was Aiuppa, underboss was Cerrone, and the consigliere was Accardo. So that's a Special Agent in Charge of the Chicago FBI.
He testified several times in front of Congress, Ed Haggerty, the Special Agent in Charge of the Chicago office. And it's interesting because he intentionally used the Sicilian dialect terms for all of these positions, right? And he says, we know that these are the terms that we've known for years that these terms are used by the membership, right? These are not public terms. He said this specifically. So he says that the boss is representando ufficiali, underboss is sotto capo, the consigliere, caporicina, and soldati, right? And then we found, through our own sort of digging through files, right, that there's wiretaps from the 60s where Chicago members, Sam Giancana, are using the term caporicina, right? So he says, look, we know that these terms are not used on the street, is what he says. They're used, but we know they've been used by the membership for years.
Yeah.
So, and we have access to things that weren't available to the public, as we'd like to underscore, until quite recently in many cases.
Yeah.
Some of the documents we're referring to, the people who wrote books in the past didn't have access to any of this.
Yeah.
Right? No one had access to a member of the Chicago family testifying until Nick Calabrese did that. But these 302s, you're not going to see those referenced in any book I've ever read, right? You're not going to see those even mentioned on a lot of websites and so forth. Some of these other things, like the wiretap I just mentioned, I haven't seen anybody outside of our circle of people mention this. This is not to say that we have some sort of magical insight into this. It's that we have access to materials. In some cases, these things were only released to the public because of the JFK document dump that happened since Trump,
Yeah.
Other ones people have had to request, through FOIA, heavily redacted files and try to piece together what they're saying. Even a lot of the information has been removed, right? So the
reason why we're going on this tangent is because we were talking about family secrets, Nick Calabrese, and we're adding context of what existed before, some of those references that existed to the organization, which was organizational info on Chicago has always been very thin. It's only recently that we even have what we have now. And so when Calabrese testifies, he doesn't, what we have from his testimony doesn't answer all of our questions because we're freaks who want to know everything. But uh, there was obviously, all of this stuff was already in place. It didn't just get invented later, because that's, we've heard that suggested before, that Chicago later co-opted Cosa Nostra structure and these ideas, which is not true. And so when Family Secrets busts a lot of this wide open, no, it busted something wide open that was already in place. And
yeah, this is important, right? We get this tiny little peek behind the curtain in a way that we never have, not since and not before, right? And we've diligently spent years trying to piece together the best quality evidence that we can for different time periods, right? To try to sort of shed light on these things, right? Yeah, but so if we say Accardo was consiglieri, right, that's not just something we're pulling out of our backside. That's something that both the highest levels of federal law enforcement, as well as actual sources within the Mafia, rather the Fradiano book, use this terminology to refer to, to someone like Accardo. If we say Capodicina or Capo, right, and not street boss, it's because evidence points to this is what the members actually used. It's just not what was used on the street by associates, right?
Yeah. And there sort of became an idea that Chicago was different from all the other LCN families, but the more we look at it, it's almost as if Chicago was almost one of the more conservative families when it comes to the bigger picture. They made less people per capita. They were much more secretive, especially as far as the structure and the insulation was concerned, because the amount of information that we have is much less than any other families. So I think the idea that Chicago is this outlier when it comes to all the rest of the Cosa Nostra families is either outdated or it's something that needs to be superseded by new information that we have. Because as far as I'm concerned, based on what we know now, that's certainly not the case. They definitely do seem to be one of the more conservative and secretive families, as opposed to some of the other families that we have, including even New York families. So
we have no sources in Chicago that have ever said that people of half Italian ancestry on their mother's side could be made. We know it did happen, but it was apparently against the protocol to do so, and in some cases, it may not have been knowledge. Like Jimmy Marcello, we'll talk about in a sec. I mean, was a person, his mother was Irish, but he was raised by his Italian stepmother, and it may not have been common knowledge that he was in fact only half Italian. We have sources going back to the 60s saying that one has to be 100% Italian in Chicago to be made, and Nick Calabrese said the same thing. Right? So it happened in New York also, even when it wasn't supposed to happen. So these things would happen. They don't have access to the genealogical tools that we do today also. So it wasn't like they were doing a thorough background check on somebody, right? And there's people that did slip in, or in some cases they may have known and sort of kind of, if they wanted the guy in, they might have kind of swept it under the table, right?
Yeah.
But these things happen. Doesn't mean people broke the rule. Sometimes doesn't mean the rule didn't exist or it wasn't usually followed.
Yeah.
But that's something that we know that in New York, at least, or even nationally, that was in the 1970s when the books reopened in the New York families. For a period, they allowed guys to get made as members who were of non-Italian ancestry on their mother's side. And in Chicago, every source we've had going back to the 60s through 2007 says that was not the case. It's interesting because Chicago has a lot of members who are of mainland Southern Italian ancestry, going back to the 1920s at least, right? People think that, I guess, that somehow this means it wasn't a traditional mafia family. They think Capone started it, right? We have sources like Nick Gentile and Augie Maniaci that are able to place Capone in context, right? And, you have a mafia family by 1930, 1931 that's probably been around for 40, maybe even, a little bit longer years.
Yeah.
Was a very important part of the sort of national network of the mafia. Capone wasn't even the first mainland Southern Italian boss. Ciccio Milano in Cleveland was made boss of that family before Capone was made boss of Chicago. I just see these things kind of thrown out there as like, well, Capone, because Capone was Neapolitan American, he couldn't have been a mafia member. We know for a fact he was.
Even among the membership in Chicago, we know from Nicola Gentile that Diamond Joe Esposito was actually a made member of Chicago.
By the early points, at the latest. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to get back to like you guys have been referencing these two member sources,
Yeah.
Scarpelli and Calabrese. Scarpelli kills himself. He flips in '88 and kills himself very soon after. So obviously he's not reporting on anything after that. His ghost isn't reporting on what happened. The Calabrese flips later. So what kind of intel do we really have on that period between, let's say, '89 through the '90s? We had gotten into, DiFronzo, Carlisi's boss, DiFronzo becomes underboss. What did Calabrese report on as far as what was going on in the '90s? Do we know? Because, the family secrets case, a lot of it was historic. A lot of it referred to events from the 1980s. What came out of that about the 1990s?
Well, I will say that Scarpelli was made in '88, and I have his 302 open right now just in case I needed to reference it. And his 302 is actually dated July of '88, so he was made for less than a year before he started or before he was investigated or interviewed by the FBI. So there's a very good chance that he did not have a good understanding of the structure, who the made guys were, who the capos were, who the boss, underboss, etc. was. And I don't know when Calabrese said that '88 ceremony happened, but if we're thinking that if we're looking at this and see that July '88 was when Scarpelli was interviewed, that's a minimum, or a maximum of 7 months that Scarpelli was made.
Yeah.
And I think it was even less than that. So Scarpelli was made for a very brief time before he started, before he was interviewed by the FBI.
Yeah, the case they were building against them with Dookie Bazile, and they were like surveilling and tailing Scarpelli in 1987. All of that was before he was even made. Like they were already springing this sting on him essentially to try to trap him before he was actually made while this was going on. And there's a point in the 302 where he tells the FBI, I keep telling you guys think I'm a bigger deal than I am. So like they're asking him about sit downs of Ferriola and this kind of stuff, and he's like, the guy was barely a soldier,
Yeah. Yeah, he was made for a very short time. One thing that is consistent between the two is something that you see prior to '88 is that there were only 5 street crews within the outfit. But we know from Scarpelli's testimony and from Calabrese's testimony that there were at least 7 street crews. So those street crews were the Melrose Park street crew, which Scarpelli had mentioned and I think this, and I'm reading it from right here, it was quoted as always having been under Aiuppa.
Yep.
And there's the Elmwood Park street crew, the Cicero or Taylor Street or West Side street crew. You'll hear it referred to as several different geographic names. The North Side street crew, Chinatown street crew, Grand Avenue crew, and the Chicago Heights crew. So I don't know if we want to talk about the structure of those crews really quickly, and who led those crews in '86 and kind of what their structures were when Carlisi took over as boss, but maybe that's something we can talk about real quick before we go too much further into Carlisi's reign.
Yeah, I can. Let's start out. If we start out, I guess moving counterclockwise from the north side, right? We can start out with so we start out with what's called the north side of the Rush Street crew, right? We can call it the Ross Prio crew, right? We know that before that, Jim DeGeorge is identified as a captain of that crew by Augie Maniaci. This is there may have been more than one crew on the north side. That's another thing too, is we actually don't know what the crew structures were like before the FBI started getting intel in the 1960s. And people assume that this is the same structure that must have existed back when Capone was boss. We have no clue that. We know those are the Italian neighborhoods and suburbs. We know what those were. We lived there and how those were structured, right? But those crews could have been broken up. They could have been dissolved. They could have moved from one place to the other. Like what we call the Elmwood Park crew, the leaders of that crew basically all came from the Grand Avenue neighborhood and moved out to the near suburb of Elmwood Park, right? So this stuff is important, but by the 80s, right, there's one North Side crew, right? Yeah. Ross Prio was boss until he died in the early 70s. He's succeeded by Dom DeBello, who's an old-time member who's sick with cancer. He is succeeded in 1976. We know from Butch Blasi, who was a Chicago member informant, that he's succeeded by Vincent Innocent Solano. Vince Solano. Yeah. Who I recently found out his father Vincenzo Solano from Ribera Agrigento was murdered in 1920. So he may have been.
Oh, wow.
We don't know if he was a member. We don't know what his involvement was, but it looks like he was involved with the mafia. And he's from a place, Ribera, where Jim DeGeorge, I just mentioned, was also from, which is a very important sort of, small town, but very important in the mafia and important in the U.S. mafia.
Yeah.
Cavalcanti family in New Jersey is largely based on a membership derived from Ribera, right? And Chicago has several members from there. So, Vince Solano could be a second generation member. Again, a lot of these guys, when you go into their backgrounds, there's a context, right? They come from something. There's a longer history to this. They didn't just fall into this out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's a guy that could have been made in the 50s or the 60s. It's hard to say, right? We don't really know in some cases when a lot of guys are made. He was a driver and a sort of bodyguard for Creo before Creo died. He was the head of Labor's International local based on the North Side, a very important labor leader. So again, these weren't guys that just controlled the union through stooges or patsies. In some case, two of the captains during this period, the 70s into the early 80s, were actually heads of Labor's International.
Presidents, the presidents of Labor's locals.
As was the Cavalcanti family controlled the union local, Labor's union local in Elizabeth, New Jersey, right? It's interesting stuff, right? So it's outright mafia control of organized labor. So he was a really important person in organized labor. He becomes captain in 1976. He dies 1992, if I believe I'm correct. Yeah. And we had Ken Ito, very well-known associate, who there was never a member source that testified on that crew and flipped. So a lot of what we know is based on different FBI reports. And Ken Ito was he was an associate, but he kind of been an associate for a long time and sort of at least knew he had a good idea of who was made and who wasn't made and who was the boss of the crew, right? Yeah. So at least through 1992, that's the boss. We kind of don't really have a great idea of what happens with the Northside crew after that. Yeah. There's some info to suggest that and this is a person that's alive today, so we're going from archaeology to anthropology, I guess, but that Johnny Pudgy Matassa may have taken over. I don't think it's controversial to say that Pudgy Matassa is a member that's been, put out by the media and law enforcement. So not us, right? But there's some evidence that suggests that he may have taken over that crew to the late 1990s. At some point, that crew seems to have been dissolved. Yeah. And folded into either Grand Avenue or the Elmwood Park crew. Yeah. But it's a neighborhood that used to be Little Sicily. We're talking about going back to like 1900. That was the home base of Joe Aiello. That was the home base of generations of intense mafia activity. Yeah. It was brought from Sicily to Chicago. It's like one of the hotbeds of Chicago's mafia history. In the 60s, it gets torn down almost entirely and replaced by the Cabrini Green housing projects. The area around it, over time, like Old Town Lincoln Park becomes gentrified. By 1980, there's very few Italians left there. I think Joey DeBarco, who was it seems like he was kind of like an acting captain at points for Solano, sort of like a kind of like a crew underboss, right? Yeah. He, an old-time member also, right? And Joey Cesar DeBarco, he was living, I think, in Lincolnwood in the northwest suburbs. Yeah. Right? Yeah. These guys would hang out over there. They had gambling, they had loan sharking in the 80s, labor racketeering and that kind of stuff. Yeah. They previously had heavy control of prostitution because there was a lot of nightlife in the Rush Street district and, vice and porn shops in the North Wells and, the sort of Skid Row area. By the 80s, this stuff is becoming heavily gentrified, right? So that's another thing to think about, too, is that there really isn't a sort of demographic base anymore. This is true across a lot of parts of Chicago, where by the 80s, a lot of the mob activity has moved out into the suburbs. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, because the North Side crew is significantly weakened by the late 80s. I mean, you could see it in files, newspaper articles, etc. There's a couple of files that I have that say that the North Side crew, that there's not a lot of money coming in, so Vince Solano's really concerned about that. Yeah. What I will say is interesting about Ken Ito is he seems to have a better understanding about the structure of what a crew is and what the family was, as opposed to other, even Italian associates. And I mean, Ken Ito was a Japanese associate, which you don't see Asian associates very often when it comes to La Cosa Nostra in the U.S.
No.
And Ken Ito was he was a Japanese American. I believe he was born in Hawaii, wasn't he?
In California. And then
okay, he was born in California. Okay.
He wasn't the only one. A lot of Japanese Americans from California went to Chicago.
Yeah.
They settled in the Old Town neighborhood on the New York side, which also had an Italian population. It was adjacent to Little Sicily.
Yeah.
I still know a bunch of these guys. I still work with a bunch of them at a grocery store. So, because a lot of them, they got out of after the internment camps in California, they kind of didn't want to be on the West Coast anymore. So they got on trains and they went to Chicago and got jobs there. Yeah, that's what he did.
When Ito flipped, we don't have his I don't personally have his 302s, but I do have some information and some files and some charts that the information from those charts and files were derived from what he gave the FBI. And he classified Solano as a territorial boss, which you wouldn't think that Ito would know what capos and so forth are, but he understood that Solano was the boss of a territory. He also had crew bosses, which are underneath Solano. And what's interesting to me is that all four of these crew bosses were listed as made at some period of time, either in the 60s, even all the way up to the 80s. These four crew bosses were considered to be made. So Ito seemed to have an understanding about who was made on the north side. And those crew bosses were Jasper Campisi, Joe DeVarco, Gus Giovanco, and Mike Glitta. And all four of those guys were either in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. They were classified as made. And it's interesting that Ito didn't have Joe Arnold as a crew boss. He had Joe Arnold as just another member of the North Side crew, which is interesting to me because Joe Arnold was obviously not Italian. It couldn't have been made. So he had other non-Italians, and even had other Italian members, made members of the Chicago family in his, I guess, the other members category. He had John Matassa, Anthony Sirignani, Frank Damani was also under there. So he understood that there were a level, there was a capo, there were other members which maybe had authority over maybe other made members or other associates, and then there were other made members which maybe fell under the umbrella of some of the more senior made members, which we know is something that happened because Nick Calabrese was subordinate to Frank Calabrese in Frank Calabrese's so-called street crew, which was within the Chinatown crew. So it seems like Ito had some kind of understanding as to how the structure of the outfit worked, if not the LCN structure, at least how the outfit operated. So
he did. They did in his testimony, like you said, in those charts that came out from Ito's work with the FBI. They didn't use terms like cappuccino or soldato or anything like that, or soldier. Like they used, but because they used territorial boss and crew boss, right? Refer to a captain and to refer to a member or a soldier, because any soldier who's a made guy is a boss he could be a boss to 20 associates that form his own crew under him, right? So he, in that sense, you could be a boss and represent any of those guys under you who are not members, to the actual family, to the structure of the family. One of those guys has a problem or something with somebody else, right? You're the one who sits down for them and represents them. So it's a sort of kind of like a good descriptive account of it. I mean, Ito had been around for a long time. He had his hands in a lot of pies. He was a major. He was an associate of the North Side crew, and but he also worked extensively with guys that were associated with the Buccieri, Taylor Street Cicero crew and the Chinatown crew, because he was a lot of these guys in different crews were partnered also, right? Just because they're in different crews, I mean, they didn't have operations or investments with each other. And one of the things that was going on through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s was bolita, which was big in the Puerto Rican and Mexican communities in Chicago and also in Northwest Indiana around the steel mills. But bolita was very lucrative. And it's funny that in Chicago, we have a Japanese American associate of the Italian Mafia who is the main liaison to the Puerto Rican organized crime networks. Answered to him. He had Puerto Rican guys who were working for him and stuff. And he also was their liaison to some of the Chinese organized crime, right?
And Ito, when Ito started cooperating with the government, they actually opened a case up against Joe Ferriola, Jimmy LaPietra, and Angelo LaPietra for the murder of a Puerto Rican bolita. I'm not sure what the exact terminology was, but somebody involved with the Puerto Rican, with the Puerto Rican bolita racket, They actually killed him. And Ito's testimony, or at least Ito's information to the FBI, allowed them to open a case up on that. Now, nothing ever came of that.
Was that Pablo Rivera? Do you remember?
Corroborating sources. I'm sorry, what was that?
Was that Pablo Rivera? That guy?
No, I think this guy's. I can't remember the guy's first name, but his last name was Gonzalez, I believe.
Okay,
so
yeah.
It doesn't really narrow it down any. I'm sorry, but
there was a few of these guys. Some of them got killed, and some of them, were reported as mob hits. Were reported as gang things, but they might have been mob hits.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, this guy had done something to insult somebody within the outfit, and so they sent. That's why they sent, Ferriola and LaPietra brothers, and I think some of the testimony or some of the information provided by Ito said, they cut his guts out and all this stuff. It was a pretty violent murder. They left him laying in the street, but
they're not guys you wanted to disrespect. I mean,
no, not at all. No. So yeah, I think Ito. I mean, Ito was a pretty sharp guy, from what I can gather by the newspaper articles and the FBI files that I've read. So the idea that he had some kind of knowledge about the structure of the outfit just because of who he was and just paying attention to what was around him, it's not surprising to me anyway. So. Yeah.
He had an interesting ethos reportedly also, where he wasn't a made member of the mafia, but he saw himself almost like as a retainer, like a samurai. A samurai was sort of retainer to a feudal lord in Japan. He saw himself, so he understood that they had their thing. He wasn't really part of it, but he was beholden to it. This is a person who he wasn't just like a associate gets thrown on ground a lot. This is a person who he was formally affiliated with the mafia, but could never be a member, right?
Yeah.
And committed tons of crime half of the mafia and received orders from them. He wasn't just some guy that worked with them or some fringe person, right? Associate could mean a lot depending on how it's used. I mean, this was like an associate with a capital A, the way like Frankie Schweiss was, right? There's people like this that we talked about it. This confuses people because they'll think that these guys were members of the mafia or something, right? They weren't, right? But Chicago, the mafia, unlike some cities like maybe Philly, for example, the mafia had for decades a really large, high level of control over criminal operations in different ways in a lot of different ethnic communities. So the sort of mafia kind of dominated the underworld. Not 100%, not everybody always kicking up, but at different times, right, in different places. And you have a lot of neighborhoods in Chicago, they're not Italians. Of course, in Italian neighborhoods, you're going to have made guys, Italian associates running around. And there's a lot of Italian neighborhoods in the suburbs where that was what's happening. But I mean, you're not going to have Italians necessarily running around the Jewish neighborhood giving out money and juice loans to Jewish guys. You're going to have Jewish guys doing it.
Yeah.
Greeks were running their own things, right? And so, like these important associates, Gus Alex, who gets, we mentioned Lenny Patrick. Lenny Patrick is a longtime loan shark killer. This is, again, a person who is not a member, but receives orders from, the mafia, kills people of them, and is essentially rewarded by having protection from them, status with them, and it's given essentially a concession to run rackets for decades in his own ethnic neighborhoods.
Yeah.
It used to be the old Jewish neighborhoods in Lawndale on the west side, which is where he was from. And then as a lot of the Jews moved out in the 50s and the 60s, and they went up to like the northwest side, up to Rogers Park and Albany Park, right?
Yeah.
And, by the 1980s, he was on Devon Avenue, right, operating over there. And this was a guy that he went back, decades. And he was affiliated with Gus Alex, who was sort of like the informal boss of the non-Italian important racketeers that are affiliated with the mafia.
Yeah.
Gus Alex is a Greek guy that seems they've had the same kind of level of clout within the Greek organized crime networks. He's close to the mafia. They respect him. They basically treat him as an equal, even though he's not a member. And in turn, he kind of manages a lot of non-Italian, Greek, and other people who are running juice and gambling in different parts of Chicago, right? And so you understand there's a whole sort of syndicate structure in place, which is not the same thing as the mafia, right? The mafia is a command structure composed of Italians at the center of this. But they have all these arms that kind of go out. They're able to extort people. They're able to take street tax. They have liaisons with Chinese organized crime, Puerto Rican organized crime, Greek, Jewish, African American, right? Yeah, so that's, that throws people for a loop sometimes, right? Because it's like, to say these people were associates doesn't mean that they weren't important and they weren't respected. It just means that they could not actually be part of what it was a closed society that really made the decisions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we have, you have a guy like Ito. That's because of the mafia was really powerful, right? They have a Japanese guy that's able to be their liaison to other ethnic communities.
Yeah.
When did Ito flip?
He was 83. Yeah.
And it's
83.
important to note, Matassa, he says Matassa is not a member, essentially, right? He's saying he's not made. Matassa is made in
yeah, he was made in 83. Although when he gave a structure to the FBI, he did have some guys that were identified as made as in the, I can't remember what terminology he used, but he had crew bosses, which were DeVarco, Glitta, Giovenco, and Campisi. And then he had the other members of the crew, which also had a couple of made guys in it, Sirignani, Damani, Matassa, which maybe he understood those guys to be made, maybe he didn't, but he had a decent understanding of who the senior guys in that crew were, and it just so happens that all four of them were Italian. And Joe Arnold wasn't one of them, which that's, to me, says a lot, because a lot of people have put Joe Arnold as like being a senior guy.
And he wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, Ito said, well, he wasn't a crew boss, so
he wasn't a nobody.
But to me, that let me know that Ito understood the distinction between you got to be an Italian guy, you got to be made to be a position of authority within this crew.
Well, you know what's funny is I referenced this before because both Ken Ito and Joe Arnold, whose real name was Joseph Aranyos, he was actually a Hungarian Jew born in Cleveland who moved to Chicago and changed Arnold, but his name was Aranyos. He was both of those guys used Italian pseudonyms on documents. So Joe Arnold went by Giuseppe Olivetti. Yeah, and Ken Ito, who's a super Japanese American guy, went by Joe Montana.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Well, what's funny about Joe Arnold is people were thinking he was Italian up until, 10 or 15 years ago, He
went by Olivetti. They might have thought that was his full name.
And I think in Ovid Damaris's book, it's on this bookshelf right behind me. I think in his book, it says either his real name or also known as was Giuseppe Olivetti. So,
things on documents,
I don't think it was until the proliferation of Ancestry and things like that were we able to actually confirm that, Joe Arnold wasn't Greek. It wasn't Italian. I'm sorry, he was Greek. Hungarian Greek.
He was Hungarian Jewish.
Or Hungarian Jewish. I'm sorry. We have access to his ancestry documents, his social security, death index, et cetera, et cetera. So
people didn't have that, so we're not knocking them.
Yeah, I mean, even 10 or 15 years ago, they didn't have that. 20 years ago when Family Secret started, we didn't really have as much access to that as we do now. So a lot of information has just come about to us because of some of the things like Ancestry, in addition to other things that we've gotten, like Calabrese's testimony and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's an important point in this, too, is that we don't knock anybody who was, especially pre-internet, before we had access to a lot of the information we have now, not just the internet in terms of getting info on the internet, but what the internet allows you to access, even just getting books, like even just trying to find mob books before you could just order anything, find records, anything like that. It's like people were doing their best and people were doing some great work, but we have to update this stuff. We have access
to the same thing. Yeah. If we were doing stuff 30 years ago, we would have probably came to the same conclusions because we would have had access to whatever newspapers were on microfilm, whatever books were published. Very little information was out there. So we're not trying to flex on people, right? But that we underscore that we have a very skeptical, sort of take on a lot of what has been sort of received wisdom, especially about Chicago, because there's been so few inside sources, and there's such an effect because of these, big like non-Italian associates, because Capone wasn't Sicilian. People think that, people have this whole sort of mythology wrapped around it, right? But it's interesting. So we're looking at the North Side crew. We're starting out with them, which to me is, I kind of start out with them because it's essentially the Little Sicily crew, right? For all we know, that crew probably directly goes back to Joe Aiello. Wouldn't surprise me, right? But that, if Pudgy Matassa was captain of that crew, he would have been the first non-Sicilian as captain. Because it's Little Sicily, most of their members were Sicilian, even the ones that weren't, like Jimmy Allegretti and Mike Litta. Mike Litta's family were intermarried with an old Sicilian family from Little Sicily, and those guys actually from Taylor Street. They weren't even from Little Sicily. They didn't grow up there. They just got plugged in with those guys through connections, right? But so that's an interesting thing. Matassa becomes the first, if he was the first guy that wasn't. And by then, that was basically already, demographically has been eroded, right? So,
and a lot of those guys had died by that time, and as we were talking about earlier, some of those rackets had dried up. Like Tony mentioned, area was no longer as Italian as it was. There was less nightclubs. There was less of a an opportunity for the outfit to operate in that area. So, I mean, Mike Litta died in '88, and I believe on one of Red Weematz, who was who was somebody who was extorted by Grand Avenue crew and knew some of these North Side guys, knew some of these Grand Avenue guys. He had mentioned that if Mike Litta was alive when Vincent Solano had died, that Mike Litta would have become boss of that crew. So there was a lot of attrition that was going on at the time. Frank Damani died in '92. Some of these other guys.
His dad was a member also. That's another thing that people think, that there was never any guys in Chicago whose sons became members. We know, it wasn't as common as it was in New York, but it was not unheard of. It definitely happened.
Yeah.
And almost every guy had a relative, even if it wasn't his father, it was his uncle, his cousin, somebody, right? So, but Frank DeMonte was made in the '80s. Was made, as far as we know, he was made in the '83 ceremony with Nick Calabrese, right? We believe the case, and Nick Calabrese misremembered his name as Frank Belmonte. There's no one else that's that in the Northside crew, right? Frank DeMonte's father was Tony DeMonte. Tony was called Tony Mack. They're from an old Sicilian family, and then his son was a member in the '80s. Yeah, but those guys are. Frank DeMonte didn't become a member until he was like what, 60 years old?
He was born in '87, so he's been 56, I guess, when he was made. So, 56.
Some of these guys waited a long time. Other one, if we move on to Grand Avenue next, we think Joey Lombardo probably got made pretty relatively young.
I was that was my next question. We need to move to Grand Avenue, or are we going down to Chinatown? I guess it depends on how you look at it.
I was going to say it's moving, but it doesn't really matter. But I guess that's a good juxtaposition.
Grand Avenue's always been kind of tied to North Side in some form or fashion too. So maybe they're a good transition point to.
Well, the neighborhoods are not far from each other. These are the old and sort of port of entry kind of ghettos. What they used to call the Patch in Chicago. They were all called the Patch.
Yeah, and you were personally familiar with Grand Avenue neighborhood too. So
that's where I'm from, and it's a short walk from the eastern part of Grand Avenue, like by Milwaukee and Grand, to what used to be Little Sicily. And by 1900, the Sicilian community expanded over the river into the Grand Avenue neighborhood. So there's a very old Mafia presence. They probably go back to the 1890s, which is true in some of these other neighborhoods too, right? But it's an old thing, and by the I mentioned earlier that what we call the Elmwood Park crew later, right? Over time, its original sort of base of power was Grand Avenue, right? We had men like Accardo, Tony Capizio, Jackie Cerrone. All of these guys were from the Grand Avenue neighborhood, right? And then moved out farther west. Accardo moved out to River Forest, of course, when he was boss. But Jackie Cerrone grew up in the Grand Avenue neighborhood right by Accardo. Moved out to Humboldt Park, which is the neighborhood west of it. And then, by the 50s and 60s, a lot of their activity was in Humboldt Park and the Galewood area in the northwest side by Harlem Avenue, and Elmwood Park, which is right across Harlem Avenue from the city of Chicago. So that grew over time, which used to be mainly based around Grand Avenue and Humboldt Park, became the Elmwood Park. That's what people refer to as the Elmwood Park, right? By the 60s and the 70s, they had some guys in that area, it seems like, right? But Joey Lombardo, we think he was probably made in the 50s or the 60s, right?
Actually, by our best estimations, late 60s, maybe early 70s at the latest. But I think
it could be anywhere from the 50s to that time point.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to tell just because of the lack of information that we have at the time period. So.
Yeah, and then DiFronzo, who we already mentioned, is from the Grand Avenue neighborhood originally. His family moves out to Stone Park, I think, when he's in high school.
Yeah,
he lived on the corner from the house he grew up in, which is still there. It's amazing. He was from Bari. He was actually born in Bari and moved to Chicago when he was a kid. He was from Capuzzo, which is a town just outside of the city of Bari. And Joey Lombardo's family was also Bares. And they were immediate paisani of each other. And the Grand Avenue neighborhood had a lot of members, a lot of community members, but also Mafia members who were either from Sicily or from Bari. Some other people mixed in too, but so it's not coincidental that these two guys who are kind of like both captains in the same time period in the 80s and the 90s, right, or 70s, 80s, 90s are both paisani from Bari.
Yeah.
But DiFronzo was outside Park. He's associated with a more suburban-oriented crew. Lombardo stays in the Grand Avenue neighborhood. And we don't really know. We don't know for a fact what crew he was made into because we don't know when he was made. We don't know who sponsored him. We don't know if he answered for crews at some point. But as far as we know, by the 70s, we know by 1974 at the very latest, because Frank Lampensero reports this, that he's a captain.
Yeah.
And he was, as far as we can tell, of what used to be the San Battaglia group.
Yeah, because
mainly based in the suburbs in Elmwood Park.
Because we know that there's some information that when Sam Battaglia died, there was a capo opening. Now, whether this was capo over his crew or whether it was just a capo opening in general, and they decided to give it to Lombardo, we don't really know what the circumstances around that are. But it was decided that Lombardo would become the new capo again, whether it was over Battaglia's old crew or whether it was just a vacancy that they wanted to fill. Capo position that they wanted to fill, we don't know. But I think Benny Siegel was the one that gave that information. We know he was very close. He was pretty close to Marshal Cafano in prison. And from what I understand, he said that Marshal Cafano was upset that Cafano didn't get that position and Lombardo did. But we do know that, by about 74 or 73 or 74, Lombardo was capo of crew, which we now know was the Grand Avenue crew. I personally don't know much about the structure of the Grand Avenue crew other than some of the higher level guys that were part of that crew or who was made within that crew. I mean, we know that Cafano was a part of that crew. We know that Cafano was a made guy, but beyond that, there's not really a lot of information we have as to who was made in that crew, who the important guys in that crew were besides Frank Schweiss. But Frank Schweiss was a German. He wasn't
from the Grand Avenue neighborhood even. He was from Bridgeport. He was a South Side guy that became a burglar and a killer for the mob. And he might have come up around people like the Dono, even in the suburbs. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
And at some point, he gets plugged in with Joey Lombardo. And
we know that Aldericio told Frank Lampensero that Caifano had previously been a soldier direct with Giancana. And then Lampensero, he mentioned that Lombardo was a captain by the early 70s. But not just that, he actually says Lombardo was part of the panel or council or maybe just a de facto panel that was helping Accardo run the family. So he's not just a captain, he's one of the guys helping run things.
Yeah.
He's an important guy. And, like we already mentioned, he went to prison 1982, I believe. Sometimes I forget which year the case comes down and which year the sentenced, I
think he was actually indicted in late 80. And then he was convicted in late 81. I think the indictment actually, what's funny is they actually got a copy of that indictment today, the very day we have this discussion. I think it was December 1980. The indictment was handed down with Pendorf, Alan Dorfman, Lombardo, and Roy Williams, I think, was also indicted in that case. So that was December 80. I think in December 81, he was convicted. So he's in prison by 1982
for bribing a U.S. senator in Nevada.
Yeah.
He had a lot of going on in Vegas. He had a lot of connections, as you already mentioned, Roy Williams with Teamsters. At the national level. Tony Spilotro, who was one of members in Las Vegas.
That's one of the few made members we know was a part of this crew. Even though he was geographically in Las Vegas, we know that he was a made member and he was part of Lombardo's crew in Grand Avenue.
As far as I know, there's at least into the 80s, there's two guys that we know of for a fact were Caifano and Spilotro. I think there's good reason to believe that Jimmy Legs D'Antonio, who was a buddy of Lombardo, who went to Wells High School with him, longtime friends. I think that there's information, I want to say somewhere that I saw that the FBI had him as made, but I think that he might have been a made member. And I believe that, when Nick Calabrese testified, they even asked him, who was in that crew? And he's like, I didn't really know a lot of those guys in that crew.
He didn't know a lot of them.
He's like, there was that one tall guy, Legs.
Yeah, Legs. He didn't even know his last name, right? He just said Legs was his exact words, I think, in the testimony. So
the Calabrese brothers, they grew up in Erie and Wood. They're from the Grand Avenue neighborhood. When they were kids, they moved out to the suburbs, but they're from that neighborhood, and they still didn't even know who the guys were,
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about that crew is obviously when Carlisi takes over as 86, Lombardo's already been in prison for a couple years. So from what we understand, Louis Eboli was acting capo of that crew, which is interesting because Louis Eboli wasn't a Grand Avenue guy either. He wasn't really from the neighborhood. He was more from the western suburbs. Yeah, he was a suburban guy who was with Aiuppa for several years. You know, he was kind of protected by Aiuppa. He was a protege of Aiuppa for several years. He owned a lot of territory. He owned a lot of businesses and had a lot of slot machines, video gambling machines, pinball machines out in the western suburbs, the Mannheim Strip, more specifically. But apparently he was put in as acting capo with that crew. Now, we don't know the circumstances behind that, whether that was something that Aiuppa kind of pushed Carlisi to make him acting capo, or whether, I guess in the timeline, he could have been acting capo before Aiuppa went away, which to me would be understandable if he was one of Aiuppa's guys in Melrose Park crew. Aiuppa could have been like, yeah, we're going to put you as head of this crew, you know, and then when Aiuppa went away, he just continued to act in that capacity, even when Carlisi became boss. But
and then he died of cancer in 1987. He died at 52 or 53 years old. He's a young guy. And people know, if you're watching this, you probably already know this or you recognize the name. He was the son of Tommy Eboli, who was a powerful leader in the the Genovese family in New York. And that's because Tommy Eboli had very close connections to Chicago. He lived in Chicago by Taylor Street and in Melrose Park. And when he was younger, his first wife, Anna Ariola, they were all from the same town in Napoli, Siciliano. So they're all paesani. And Sam Ariola, who was the maternal uncle of Louis Eboli, was kind of this big sort of like bone crusher kind of guy. Some people have thrown his name around as having been a member. I don't think he was ever identified to the extent that I would be comfortable that he could have been. I don't know, but
I mean, he's kind of in those. Yeah, he's kind of in those dark years of like the 70s and 80s where.
Yeah, and then Eboli's.
We just don't know for sure.
His uncle by marriage was Guido Di Chiaro, who was close to Paul Rica. He was another guy, Napolitan ancestry, that was sort of part of this kind of like circle of people out there in Melrose Park and adjacent suburbs, which had a large Italian population going back at this point over 100 years, right? So there's a circle of people. Some of them seem to be close to Aiuppa. Some of them seem to be close to Rica in previous decades. We're not always sure what crew they might have belonged to, whether they were members or associates. They belonged to somebody. They answered either to administration or to a captain. But the problem is in the park, multiple crews operated in the Melrose Park, sort of Cicero area. So we talk about the Melrose Park crew, we mean the Aiuppa crew, but they also had activities going on in Cicero, right? The Battaglia crew had activities in Melrose Park, the Dodona crew, right? We don't always know who was exactly formally with who.
Yeah. And we've always used geographic terminology just for ease of use, and maybe that was something that was used in real life where the family itself decided, well, we're just for ease of structure, we're going to make these crews roughly geographic, but members don't necessarily have to fall within this geographic area to be a member of this particular crew. I mean, we don't know exactly how they structured it, especially. You know, we were talking about Lombardo earlier. If he was a member of the Battaglia crew, which is more out in Melrose Park, or more headquartered around Melrose Park, and then if he took over that crew, did he relocate to Grand Avenue, or did we don't really know?
Elmwood Park, which had a much stronger historical association with his neighborhood, we don't really know. He came up under a guy, Freddie Pascenti from the neighborhood, Grand Avenue, knew him. He was a corrupt cop that was an outfit associate, right? He wrote a book. Freddie Pascenti pointed to Johnny Bananas DiBiase, the original Johnny Bananas, because later on Johnny DiFronzo got called Johnny Bananas also. But this guy, Johnny Bananas DiBiase, was an old-time member. He was identified by as a member also. So I'm pretty. He died in the 70s, I want to say. And we don't know what his crew affiliation was. We don't know if he was with what we call the Elmwood Park crew. We don't know who he was with. He was a soldier, and we don't know who he answered to. But he seems to have been the sort of mentor to Joey Lombardo before he was, So that's what we know. And then 87, Eboli dies. We believe he was probably acting boss. We have no sources that actually designate him officially as a capo of a crew, right? And after him, there's a lot of question marks.
Yeah, we really don't know for certain. I do want to say, just to backtrack just a little bit, it's interesting to me. I don't know whether this is just coincidental or it's an interesting footnote in the history of the outfit that a lot of the guys who became part of what would eventually become the Grand Avenue crew or the Joey Lombardo crew originally came up under Milwaukee Phil Alderizio. So from what we understand, he was subservient to Battaglia. He may have had a role in the Consiglio. We don't really know for certain. So it could be that.
Yeah. He told, as Eric already mentioned, he told Frank Pompensero in 1969 that when Giancana was boss, in which, according to this report, right, Giancana was boss until 66, and that when Giancana was boss, that Alderizio and Caifano reported as soldiers directly to Giancana. Now, we don't know if they were made under a captain and then transferred to Giancana. We don't know what happened after Giancana. Pompensero said that as far as he knew, as of 1969, Alderizio was still a soldier. He told the FBI, which means he wasn't formally introduced to him as having any other position, which we know in the Mafia, you have to be introduced by a third party as a member, as amico nostra in the first place. But we also know that one has to be reintroduced by a third party if one is bumped up to captain or an administration position.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been that just Alderizio had this group of guys and they had become solidified as sort of,
right.
Maybe they took those guys and they said Lombardo could have his own crew with those guys, and they just kind of left the Melrose Park territory, I guess, so to speak, to Aiuppa and Carlisi and Marcello and so forth. And they said Aiuppa, or maybe when they promoted Lombardo to capo, they said you can have these guys. You already got, sort of this Phil Alderizio crew anyway. So, yeah, but that's complete speculation on my part, which I don't typically try to do, but I think there's enough coincidence there that I think it's something that should be mentioned. And
Caifano was with Alderizio, and they were both soldiers answering to Giancana during that period, right?
Yeah, and Frank Schweiss, there were several other guys that also were under Alderizio, Herb Weiner, that worked with Alderizio that eventually became part of that Grand Avenue crew. So
what speaks to that too is I've seen reports, I think they were from the 70s, where they were talking about Tony Spilotro, and they say that he owes his power to Alderizio, that he was kind of groomed by Alderizio. I don't know if you guys have seen those, but I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that's well known, but apparently there was a close relationship between Spilotro and Alderizio when he was coming up.
Yeah, and with Nicoletti also, right? Nicoletti and Alderizio were associates of each other, right? Before they were even made, it would seem like all these guys. These are guys that go back to Taylor Street together. They're sort of part of the same community formation, right? And were known as sort of like violent killers, hitters, right? Before they became sort of well-known, sort of more boss level figures, right? Whether or not they ever had an administration position, they were sort of considered senior or like elite members at a certain point by the late 60s, right? This will be controversial for people because they'll probably have a lot of opinions because I've read different things, which we can't get into because it'll be a whole rabbit hole, right? But there's a lot of information out there about Spilotro from different sources, right? There's also a lot of different information, conflicting information about Nicoletti, which is all, of course, he's killed in the 70s, so that's before this time period. But there's sources that tie Spilotro's rise to both Nicoletti and Alderizio, who are not unrelated to each other, even if maybe they were. Who knows if they were ever actually formally affiliated in the same crew, right? They were close to each other personally.
Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned earlier about it getting kind of muddled after Eboli dies, and that's a sort of understatement because I've seen conflicting reports as to who took over after Eboli died. We've seen Tony Centracchio, we've seen Jimmy Coso. Lombardo gets out of prison in '92. It's unknown what his role was after he got out of prison. Did he take over as capo of that crew again, or did he become a sort of consigliere or underboss type of guy, or was he even in a formal position, maybe just as like a advisory role because of his parole restrictions? We don't know, but
we could do a whole episode just on this.
We could do a whole episode just on that. There's just too little information for me at least, to definitively state what the structure of that crew was post Eboli, and I guess pre, another guy now, that's supposedly in charge of the crew now. What that 20-year gap encompassed as who was head of that crew. I mean, you also got Jimmy D'Antonio, so we don't really know for sure.
Dies in a car accident in the 90s.
Yeah, he died in '93, I believe. He died of a car accident, but there's a lot of conflicting information as to who led that crew in the intervening years between Eboli's death in 87 and when Lombardo got out in 92. And we don't even know if Lombardo even formally took back control of that crew.
We don't know if he ever lost it, right? Because
we don't know. We don't know if these guys were just in acting capacity for Lombardo. We don't know if Lombardo, what his role was when he came back out of prison. But
you could say he appears to have been somebody important, but we don't know if that means that he was formally still the boss of that crew after he got out of prison. He was on parole for a number of years after that. We do know that he was sort of caught by both police and journalists as he was being chauffeured around by Christy Spino, who was a city employee at the time for Streets and Sand, who didn't have a criminal record, which is nice. He was seen in public. I can tell you in the Grand Avenue neighborhood, he was seen in public. He still lived in the same apartment where the same apartment in the building with his wife, whose cousin was Joey Andriacchi, where Joey Andriacchi grew up. So a lot of these guys moved out to Oak Brook, or they moved out to some of these fancy suburbs. The Cerrones went all the way out to Barrington and that kind of stuff, living in these sort of wealthy enclaves in the suburbs. And Joey Lombardo, until he went on the lam for Family Secrets in the 2000s and had to go into hiding, was living in the same 6-flat apartment building on West Ohio across from Mitchell Schoolyard.
Yeah, I believe the family
driving U.S. senators, guys living in like a 1-bedroom apartment.
Yeah, I think that the family just recently sold that, if I'm not mistaken, too, right? Just within the past year or two. So
the gentrification has been very intense. There's very few towns left now, but some have made money off of the real estate, right?
Yeah. Now, what little information we do have from that crew, I've got a couple files that say that mention some specifics about that crew. But again, most of this is pre-Scarpelli, pre-Nick Calabrese. So take it with a grain of salt.
And we don't even know. Like, so for example, people believe that Jimmy Coso, right? That he succeeded Eboli, right, as captain or acting captain was of this crew. Right, or that after Lombardo in the 2000s, so I believe that Coso died in 2007, if I'm not mistaken.
Coso died in 2007.
Also of cancer, I think. Right, he wasn't very old either.
Yeah, he was only 71 or 70 or 71.
And we actually have never been able to 100% confirm whether or not he was made. So
that's true. Fred
Fred
Buscemi specifically said he wasn't a made guy. Red We Met specifically said he wasn't a made guy. So
these guys all flipped early on, right? So we're talking about decades after that.
So I mean, it's the possibilities there that he could have been made in the 90s and installed as acting capo of this crew. We just don't know for sure.
Yeah, well, Frank Amonti was getting to the point where he'd almost be collecting Social Security by the time he was Medicare eligible by the time he's Medicare. By the time he's made, right? So I mean, his was a member, right?
I'll also say
and also I think we should say that Coso's father was identified by the FBI as a member.
Yeah, he was identified. He was on the 80. He was on the 85 list, and he was also on the 93 list. Sam Jellybelly Coso or Jelly Coso.
Yeah, Jelly Coso
was identified as made.
Who people will know, maybe if they're Chicago aficionados, he was the owner of Rose's Sandwich Shop, which I believe was named after his mother. But not his wife, maybe Jimmy's mother, one of them. And he had a sandwich shop on Grand Avenue, which is where in 1973 Richard Kane, Scout City was clipped.
Yeah,
very, very infamously. So he wasn't just an innocent Italian sandwich shop owner who didn't know nothing, right?
Yeah,
Was full times by the feds as a member, and I believe he was.
Yeah, we mentioned the 85 and the 93 list. There was also it wasn't really a list so much as a report that was released in 2000 by the Chicago Police Department. It's my opinion, at least my personal opinion, that they got that information from the FBI because I don't think the Chicago Police Department would really have intelligence as to who was made and who's not made. And they were working in conjunction with the FBI as far as strike forces and task forces and things like that. So I believe that they did get some of that information about who was made from the FBI. So they did have Jimmy Coso as a made guy on that list. Now, that's not to say that list is infallible because they do have some contentious names on that list. Names like Joe LaMancha, maybe Marco D'Amico, some other things where there've been disputes about whether or not this guy was actually made or not. But for what it's worth, Jimmy Coso was identified in the Chicago Police Department 2000 list. I think it was year 2000. He was identified as a made member. So, I mean, I guess the possibilities there that he could have been made in the 90s, but we just don't know for certain because of the lack of member sources and information that we have in that time period.
And the Chicago police had, I believe, a report from the Red October investigation they did in the 90s, right? That had Joey Lombardo as a consigliere.
Yeah.
And he might have been. We don't know. It's possible. He seemed to have.
We just don't know. Yeah.
And then we know from the prison reportings that Frank Calabrese Jr. did with his father, right? We've been able to sort of read those and reread those. I know you've read them a bunch of times. Times. And they kind of do help to at least triangulate against some of the information we have from other sources. And they say very clearly Joey Lombardo was shelved at some point.
Yeah, at some point.
At some point in the late 90s, it seems that he was shelved.
Yeah. Because Frank was conversing. Frank Calabrese was talking with his son, and I think this may have been 99 or 2000. He did mention that Lombardo was supposed to be on the shelf. Yep. Now I could be misinterpreting the way that's written, but I believe his language does say shelf. So it does mention that specifically. So now who put him on the shelf, under what circumstances, we don't really know. So
doesn't Nick Calabrese say in his testimony that just like every other family, they shelved members?
No, I don't think he used the word shelved in his testimony.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up, but I'm not 100% certain on that, Eric.
Does he say anything about them, like, because we know that some families, we have sources around the country who say, like, they use different terms for that. They don't say shelf, but they say, like, he's out, he's this, I could be misremembering.
Yeah, he said he's supposed to be on the shelf. I mean, it was pretty clear from the context, Okay. But it's not as good as Nick Calabrese testifying about it, because then you have cross-examination, you have somebody asking questions, right? He's under oath and so forth, right? But what we have with that is we have Frankie Jr. talking to his dad, and basically, he's wearing a wire on his dad, which I think a lot of, that's, the whole family secrets comes out of that, and the fact that Nick testified, right? But his dad is kind of trying to school him, even though Frank Jr. is half Irish and isn't, can't be made. And he's trying to school his kid in how things work, right? So he's also sharing a lot of things that he wouldn't have shared before in prison, right? They talk in code, but there's a lot of interesting conversations. And I think once you're able to parse it, it's a valuable source that we have to use.
Yeah.
Right. And Mark and I have discussed these things a lot, because I think that they do shed light on these things.
Yeah. So, and I think his reference was that his reference to Lombardo was being shelved was he was talking about Joe Andriacchi. He was going over there and talking with Joey Lombardo when Lombardo was supposed to be shelved. So it was kind of like,
which is
saying like something like Joe Andriacchi shouldn't have been doing that or something like that, which he also mentioned some friction between the North and the South, which I don't know if we'll get to that in this particular episode, but it's certainly something that's going to be mentioned at some point in the future. But he did mention it under that context that Joe Andriacchi was meeting with Lombardo. I don't think he used Lombardo's real name. He used, his code. I think he used the
Joey West and Joey East.
Yeah, Joey West and Joey East, something like that. But he mentioned that he was shelved under that context. So real quick about Grand Avenue before we move on, there is an FBI file that says that Anthony Centracchio succeeded Joe Lombardo as capo of the Grand Avenue crew, in which we already know there's an issue with that, because Nick Calabrese testified that he thought that Louis Eboli was capo of that crew. There's other information out there which seems to suggest that Eboli was capo of that crew, and that Centracchio, maybe he didn't immediately succeed Lombardo as capo of that crew. There's some other issues with Centracchio's position. You see some newspaper articles which state that he was one of the top 3 or 4 guys. But again, going back to these Frank Calabrese prison tapes, they seem to insinuate that Centracchio was inflated by the papers to be maybe a higher stature than he actually was within the outfit. So that's just another mystery for us as far as, and a gap of knowledge for us as far as that's concerned. But
so if we get any comments, we'll say this was the case, right? You have to keep in mind, right? we're very careful about what source this comes from and how much confidence we can have in these kind of pronouncements.
Yeah, there's just a lot of conflicting information. They're good sources, but we don't know how good they are because some of the information conflicts with other information. So,
especially when we get into the 90s, now we're starting to, except for the boss, which we have, I think, Nick Calabrese to rely on. Aside from that, a lot of other stuff is sort of
a boss and maybe a couple of the crews, but other than that, a lot of it's still pretty contentious. Unless we ever get a hold of unless we ever get a hold of Nick Calabrese's 302s. So maybe he provides more detail that wasn't necessarily needed in the course of Family Secrets, but we just don't know until when or if we ever see those 302s.
He might have talked. I mean, the FBI got the consiglieri thing from the 2005 indictment document for Family Secrets somewhere, right? Even though Calabrese didn't talk about it during his testimony, right? But it doesn't mean that the FBI didn't ask him about it when they debriefed him. There could be all sorts of things in the 302 that didn't come up during the case because they're not relevant, right?
Yeah.
So that's keep in mind. But those haven't been released to us.
Yeah. And one more thing about Lombardo is that he made some appeals as far as his involvement with the outfit when he was indicted in the Family Secrets case. And the FBI, or I guess the federal government, Department of Justice, whatever the case may be, they provided some information that he was involved with the outfit in between his release from prison in 92 and his indictment in the Family Secrets case. But in my opinion, the information is pretty weak. I mean, it amounted to... I think there were some instances where Paul Shiro said that, quote unquote, Lombardo was his boss. Some other people saying that if Lombardo wouldn't have been in prison, Spilotro wouldn't have been killed. And Pat Spilotro, he wasn't even an associate, he was just the brother of somebody who was a member of the outfit, saying that Lombardo was still involved. So some very tenuous information that, in my opinion, the DOJ said could be used to support Lombardo's involvement in the outfit, but it's pretty weak in my opinion. But I guess it was enough in there, as far as they were concerned, to say that Lombardo had continued to operate as part of the Chicago outfit or as part of the Chicago, racketeering conspiracy or what have you.
Well, let me say one more thing about this because I think this it needs to be addressed. I brought this up a number of times to people, right? It's another piece of information that we have to sort of add to this. There was a book that came out a few years ago from a well-known criminologist from University of Illinois, Chicago, John Hagedorn, who's done a lot of research over the years on street gangs or oral history research. He had a lot of connections in the street gang world, and he taught a class for years at UIC, which I went to a long time ago. We won't say how long, but he taught a class there, and apparently a son of a member, an Italian kid, took the class because it's about street gangs. In Chicago, that's a big deal, and not also for white kids and Italian kids, right? It's it's a sort of part of the street culture and long history. And so this kid takes this class and basically tells him, look, if you want to know the real deal, he puts him in the guy's dad finds out about the class according to the book, and he holds a couple of clandestine interviews with him. And the guy claims to be a member, a soldier in the Grand Avenue crew, who's basically retired by this point in the 2000s. And he's like, you don't really understand what's happening with the street gangs. I can tell you what was happening during the 90s because I understand. I was part of this world, right? And this guy who goes by the pseudonym of Sal Martino, and the guy also talked to another, Hagedorn interviewed another old-time member who was a Sicilian guy that he refers to as the Don, right? Who was telling him about long-standing narcotics links between the Chicago outfit and black street gangs going back to the 60s, right? But this guy, Sal Martino, had been a recent member in the Grand Avenue crew, right? A soldier, and he refers to Joey Lombardo as the old man and said that he was holding meetings in restaurants, which is a good place to hold a meeting because, guy walks into a restaurant, walks up to your table, says a couple things to you. Law enforcement is surveilling you. If they are, right, what are they going to say? Well, I'm eating my fish dinner on Friday.
Yeah.
I can't control who walks into a restaurant. It's a public place, right?
Yeah.
So, but he says that, essentially the Grand Avenue crew under Joey Lombardo's direction was directing activities of Latino street gangs in the West Town, Elmwood Park area. And that this was related to, people should check out the book. It's very interesting, right? But this guy's getting this he's doing interviews with senior gang members from the mostly Puerto Rican gangs in the area. an old school Italian gang in the area, the Insane C Notes that were part of this, and with two guys who claim to have been made members of the Chicago Mafia.
Yeah,
pretty interesting stuff. And so this definitely paints Lombardo. What that means, Lombardo was actively the captain, if he was a consigliere or something else, or if he was shelved but was still attempting to. Lombardo seems like the kind of guy that he would never go down. You know,
yeah,
very charismatic, outgoing, active sort of person, right?
Yeah.
You know, really, if things had worked out differently, you could have seen him being the boss of the family, right?
Yeah. And yeah, if he wasn't, if somebody like Chris Spina, who again, he's alive right now. I don't want to pass judgment on anybody who's still alive, but there's definitely evidence that he was driving Lombardo around town. He didn't have a criminal record, so if Lombardo wanted to use somebody as a messenger to the rest of the crew or the rest of the family, then Spina would be somebody who would be ideal as somebody who didn't have a criminal record that Lombardo could associate with and be able to pass messages between the two. So
Lombardo is definitely up to stuff. I mean, we see also a CPD, a Chicago Police Department report, where he's being surveilled by the CPD in the 90's. He has like a page boy hat. He's going around on his bike, like people know in the neighborhood. Yeah. He was going to this place, Mike's on Grand Avenue. It was like a Filipino diner that used to be there, and he was going in and out of like restaurants and gangways between buildings and like jumping into cars and driving away. Yeah. He knew he was being tailed. He was like dodging his tails, and he was getting into cars and going in and out of restaurants. He was doing something. Now, does that mean he was shelved and was avoiding?
Yeah, we just don't know when. Yeah, we don't know when or if that happened. But I will say that. Yeah, there's also some files from the early 90's. I'm going to say 93, 94, where Lombardo is fresh out of prison, and it does say that he's trying to get his he's trying to get his old Grand Avenue street crew back together. So it sounds like something that maybe the crew was in disarray. He got out of prison. There's a lot of other guys going to prison at the time. Maybe he's trying to get them back together. We don't know whether that's for him to make a power play, whether that's just to get his crew back together. We don't really know.
Yeah, we don't know if the crew was dissolved or not. Also,
yeah, we don't know.
We don't know if it was broken up. Members were reassigned.
And I have Scarpelli's 302s open right here. He does say that when Lombardo went to prison, he does say that Eboli succeeded Lombardo. So Scarpelli also says that Louis the Mooch, Joey Lombardo was replaced by Louis Eboli, a.k.a. Louis Eboli, Louis the Mooch, but pointed out that Eboli died several months ago. So he went on to say that he does not know who was currently in charge of the Grand Avenue crew. So this had been again, July 88, when Scarpelli began cooperating with the FBI. So
we don't know a lot after this, but
lots of questions about Grand Avenue crew at this time period that we just don't have enough sources to give definitive answers to at the moment.
Well, if we move one crew over west, counterclockwise, right? The original Grand Avenue crew, which is we call the Elmwood Park crew at this point, right?
Yeah.
And I already mentioned that Joey Lombardo's cousin-in-law, the cousin of his wife, was Joe Andriacchi, right? Joey Andriacchi, Joey A, and on those prison tapes, Frank Calabrese Sr. refers to him as Joey West or the Pancake Flipper because he operated a pancake house, right?
Yeah.
So this is a pretty well-known person. It's also a person who's still alive, and in general, we try not to, we're not a journalistic outlet, right? We're more of a historical outlet, right?
Yeah.
But we're talking about stuff that came out in
stuff that came out 30 years ago. So, but
not saying it,
I think Andriacchi himself would even admit that it's no secret that he's been tied to Chicago outfit activity in the past.
It's been said about him and not by us, right? So that's the part, right? So, but that so as far as we know, he's an important guy. We know that Johnny DiFronzo, right, was captain of this crew.
Yeah.
At some point, control over this crew is relinquished to a captain, right? A new captain is appointed. We think this is probably happening sometime in the late 80's, right?
Yeah, mid to late 80's, yeah.
It's possible that Eligio Lee Magnifici, right, who died in 89, I believe.
Yeah, December of 89, he passed away.
Was another member, right, who was not carried on the 85 list by the FBI. He had some early arrests for some pretty brazen crimes, like in the 1940s and stuff. And then he's not mentioned in FBI files hardly at all for decades after that. So he appears to have been like sort of like a real sleeper You know, it seems like I was like a young thug who cleaned up his act and got out of it, right?
Yeah, he's very briefly mentioned in some 80's files as being connected to the Elmwood Park crew, or being connected to the Jackie Cerrone crew, is what they still called it by the 80's.
Yeah.
Because I think the FBI still carried that as sort of Jackie Cerrone's own personal crew, and didn't really carry it as its own independent street crew at that point. So, well, we knew it was its own crew by 83 because they were making they were represented by DiFronzo in the 83 making ceremony that Calabrese was made in. So
even though they didn't bring any members in, it's another sort of
they did, yeah.
At that ceremony, they didn't bring any members in, right? But DiFronzo's still there, as sort of panel of captains that were officiating over that ceremony, right? So we know for a fact that in '83, right, that DiFronzo was captain. He probably succeeded, as you said, Joe Gags around 1971, 1972, after Joe Gagliano died, right? Yeah. And after about 75, Cerrone was underboss anyway. So by 70, the latest, you would think that.
Yeah, mid-70s at the latest. I think he was on parole for a couple years, but after that, it would probably be a safe bet that he was underboss at least by that point. So.
Yeah. So by that point, at the latest, I mean, again, allowing for the fact that you can have acting captains, official captains, right? By the mid 70s, Johnny DiFronzo's captain of the Elmwood Park crew. Sometime after that, we got to think between 86 and 89, probably. We think that Johnny DiFronzo becomes either underboss and then probably becomes acting boss of the family, which is why people think he was the official boss of the family. If he was, we don't have information to fully support that, right?
Yeah.
And because what Calabrese said in his testimony was it went Aiuppa, Carlisi, Monteleone.
Yeah.
Carlisi dies in 1997. He goes to prison in 1992 or 93, right? 93, I think, is when he's sentenced.
DiFronzo goes to prison in 93, yes.
No, but Carlisi goes to prison in 90.
Oh, yeah. Carlisi he's indicted in December of 92, and he's also imprisoned in December of 92 because he wasn't given bail or wasn't given bond.
Yeah. So he was under detention even before he was convicted.
Yeah. So December 92, he never saw outside the prison cell again after December 92. So.
Yeah, we think that it's possible. I think we both agree that it's possible that because Ferriola died in '89, and that's the same year that it seems that Carlisi is spending a lot of time in Florida. We think that it's possible that DiFronzo could have been acting boss for him, at least while he was out of town. That seems possible. If anybody was, it was probably him.
Yeah.
But then DiFronzo, like you said, also 92, 93, he comes under indictment with Don Angelini for the Rincon.
And Carlisi as well was also indicted in that case, but he was eventually. I think Carlisi was acquitted in that case. So
didn't do many favors because.
Oh yeah, I mean.
There's a lot of heat coming down on these guys. I don't think we can possibly talk about all these cases, right? So.
Yeah, and it's just so happens that Northside and Grand Avenue, they weren't really affected by a lot of these indictments during this time period. So, but Elmwood Park was. I'll also say that it wouldn't surprise me if Ferriola was never underboss. Maybe he was simply because he had health issues that, we have files going back to, 84, 85, where he's already having serious health issues. So
he wasn't at the 83 ceremony.
He wasn't at the 83. We don't know why he wasn't at the ceremony. Calabrese said he wasn't a captain. We covered that in the previous episode, but he was having some major health issues by the mid 80s. So whether he was in an administrative capacity or not, we know that probably DiFronzo was in some type of administrative capacity by the late 80s, probably 89 at the latest. Whether he was underboss or acting boss, newspaper reports say that, according to law enforcement sources, which I gather as the newspaper getting information from the FBI, maybe from some court documents, that DiFronzo was acting boss of the Chicago outfit at that point in time by 89. With Carlisi as official boss, DiFronzo is acting boss.
I think that's reasonable. Then they both go to prison essentially around the same time.
Yeah.
And then we think for around 93 that there's a good chance that Joey Andriacchi was serving as Andrew.
Yeah. That year or so that Andriacchi was in prison, that DiFronzo was in prison, We believe that Andriacchi was acting boss. Again, he's alive, but I do have some files here that say they give a physical description that matches exactly Andriacchi's exact physical description. And it says that this redacted individual is now head of the Chicago LCN. We've also got, Fosco's alluded to it in his writings that Andriacchi, everybody, because DiFronzo was away, everybody went to Andriacchi, and Andriacchi sort of became the acting boss by default for that year or so that DiFronzo was away in prison.
Yeah.
And I'll say, only because I have it open right here in front of me, Scarpelli describes a crew headed by John DiFronzo and centered in the Elmwood Park, Illinois area. Scarpelli stated that the DiFronzo crew is a very tight, very strong crew, and commented that you can't do anything in Elmwood Park without permission. So, that goes to pretty much what we understand about the Elmwood Park crew. We've always understood it to be a very tight, very strong crew. DiFronzo, Peter DiFronzo, we understand Nick Calabrese testified that he was made in 88. He also testified that Rudy Fratto was made in 88. Yep. You've got Joe Andriacchi. Yep. You've got Marco D'Amico, who, even if he wasn't made, he was a really strong associate. So Willie Messino was a made guy. So you've got a pretty strong crew there in the late 80s, early 90s time period. So
we talked about this before, but when a guy gains power in a family, we often see the guys close to him get made. So it would make sense if those two guys got made in 88, that would have,
it's true.
Yep.
What the official promotion was, it makes sense that DiFronzo was on the rise at that time if his brother, close associate, got made.
Yeah.
He didn't sponsor anybody in 83, even though he was in the ceremony, but in 88, he sponsors guys, including his brother.
Yeah, but it could be that 83, they may have already had enough guys there that they didn't necessarily need to make anybody. We didn't mention Michael Gastaldo, who I don't think he's ever been listed as officially made, but I think there's been some some pretty good evidence that indicates that he was a strong made guy. But if I remember from what Fosco said right on his site, was that DiFronzo made Peter DiFronzo because Peter DiFronzo was going back and forth between DiFronzo and Carlisi and the other crew so often that I think the decision was just made, well, why don't we just make him, So
associate.
So they just made Pete DiFronzo for the fact that he was just running between the crews all the time. So
and this is something I think that we could have a whole episode on again, right? But we have access to FBI reports from the early 90s that specifically link Chicago LCN in general, but the Elmwood Park crew specifically to a number of affiliates or operatives of essentially all the major mafia groups of Italy. In Elmwood Park, Addison, adjacent areas of northwest side of Chicago, in the decades after World War II, not only did a lot of Italians from the city move out there, there was a large wave of second wave immigrants from Sicily and southern Italy that came into these places, as they did into the city and also into Cicero and some other places. But a huge sort of Elmwood Park cruise territory around like Harlem Avenue, and then going out farther west to Addison and Bloomingdale and some of these other towns was a major area of concentration, right, for both Italian Americans and a new wave of Italian immigrants. And we have access. This stuff hasn't been discussed publicly, but they're heavily redacted, so some of the names are missing. We've been able to fill in some of the blanks. This is something I paid a lot of attention to because I think it was a really important dynamic during the 70s through maybe up into the 2000s. But the members of Sicilian Cosa Nostra, of the Bades Sacra Corona Unità, of the 'Ndrangheta, and of the different factions of the Neapolitan Camorra all had activities and even representatives in Chicago were dealing large quantities of narcotics on behalf of the Chicago Mafia, and were essentially operating in they said they were operating on behalf of the Chicago LCN. And it seemed
ties to Rockford too, weren't there? I'm misremembering, or were there ties to Rockford in that as well?
Yeah, but there were ties to Rockford, but those were different. Okay. Rockford had its own set, and also the area around Beloit and the sort of border area between Wisconsin and northern Illinois had their own sets of dynamics. They actually identified a number of different patterns of this was a report called Italian Organized Crime in Illinois. And some of these things that were happening were connected to Chicago outfit. Some of it was connected to Rockford, which at this point, by '93, the FBI actually believed that the Rockford outfit, which we know was an independent family at least up through the '80s, they believed that it actually was part of Chicago at this point, which we don't really know we don't really know after the '80s what Rockford's status is. As a family, they were definitely a small, secretive, heavily Sicilian family that was represented by Chicago on the commission, and had members who were from Chicago who got made into Rockford, right? Who were actually Chicagoans, right? So there was long-standing ties. It's a very interesting question that we can get into in a later episode. We can do probably multiple episodes even on some of these things. But yeah, there was one set of relationships that was centered around Rockford. Another set of relationships was centered around Chicago itself, which included all sort of four of the major mafia groups in Italy.
There's a Camorra boss involved, correct?
What's that?
There's a Camorra boss involved as well, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it one more time?
Camorra boss.
Maybe it's on my end. I didn't hear it.
Oh.
Are you hearing me here?
You're a little muddled on my end. I don't know if it's just for me.
Yeah, not to speak for Eric, but I think he said there was a Camorra boss, Tony.
Yes. There was actually factions related to both the Nova Familia block, which had been, I mean, by '93, this was no longer a thing anymore in Napoli, but the Nova Familia and the Nova Camorra Organizzata. So the Cotolo-led organization and versus the organization of sort of more affiliated with the Sicilian Mafia. There was two blocks in the Camorra in the '70s and '80s. They identified high-level members who were living in Chicago and identified links that they had to Chicago LCN.
Yeah.
They also identified a Chicago area representative of the Calabrian and 'Ndrangheta. And I found some other things I was recently looking at that, at least going back to the '60s and the '70s, there was a locale, like an actual branch or almost like a family sort of the 'Ndrangheta based in Chicago. So there's a lot that we don't know.
Yeah.
This isn't happening in a place where guys like Joe Ferriola and Carlisi are bosses without there being, they're not stepping on, guys' toes, right? There's some level of cooperation. The FBI was saying that they're working on behalf of the local outfit, right?
And Messina wasn't, there were files saying that he was quote unquote shaking down drug dealers. So, whether he was actually shaking them down or whether they were actually giving him money that, they were supposed to be giving him, as part of some kind of formal affiliation. We don't really know, but it's just a brief mention of Messina shaking down drug dealers. And of course, we know, I think it was Messina's son, Chris Messina, he was in prison for drug dealing, right? In the late '80s, early '90s. Yeah.
Relative Chris Cardi was also was an associate or a cop who was busted for a huge narcotics operation in the '70s and got whacked after it, which some people have interpreted that as, well, he was whacked because you're not supposed to be dealing drugs, but he wasn't a member. That rule didn't apply to him. And law enforcement believed that he was whacked because important leaders in Chicago LCN had invested in his drug operation and that he lost their money.
Yeah.
And they were worried he was going to flip. So this is another question, but Chicago never had the level of sort of like heavy involvement that somebody like Carmine Galante did with narcotics. But we've actually covered a lot of evidence that there was different levels of involvement.
Yeah, it was more indirect, I think, than
bankrolling it through.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of evidence of members being directly involved with it. To the extent of, like you said, Carmine Galante or some Banana Pizza Connection, or something like Angelo Ruggiero. We don't have anything to that extent, Gene Gotti or what have you. But
this was true in other families too, like Philly, where there tended to be. The actual handling of narcotics tended to be through associates for the most part. It was sort of,
but they still got their piece of
select
it.
Number of Officially, the policy was that you weren't supposed to do it, but what that did was that sort of created a very regulated kind of market for who was allowed to do it.
It comes from Valachi, where Joe Valachi testified that he was told the Chicago family paid its members to not do drugs, but as you found, they were still dealing drugs. It just might not have been on the scale.
Yeah, and that was in '63. He said they paid the members who had been dealing drugs. And we found lots of ties that before 1963, probably before the Appalachian, meeting busted in 57, right? They're going back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There was a lot of ties. And the FBN, which spent a lot of time surveilling mafia-connected drug networks, said that what they called the Chicago Italian Organization, was responsible for supplying drugs in about a third of the country. So everywhere from Chicago down to Texas and even west, they were getting, looks like they were getting it from Canada, they were getting it from Europe through like French Connection type networks, getting it from Florida through the connections to the Tampa family. We've talked about some of this stuff a lot. There's a lot there, right? And even in the 1950s, I mean, Accardo was directly linked to some of the largest heroin network dealers in Chicago. One of them was a friend of his who led the FBN to his mansion in River Forest 25 times under surveillance.
Yeah, as far as the 80s and 90s are concerned, we know Rockford was pretty heavily involved in narcotics, and we don't know if they had some kind of partnership going on with Chicago or what the deal was with that either. But
we don't even know if they were part. We don't even. We don't know.
We don't know. Yeah, but I do know that Rockford was pretty heavily involved in narcotics dealings in the late 80s, at least. So.
It's a connection connected to the Rockford area, so we don't know if that intersected with Chicago. But these guys were passing through Chicago. Chicago was right there.
These guys are from Chinese, and there's a street in Chicago that's named after Chinese, West Addison by Harlem Avenue. This isn't to say anything disparaging about Chinese. I mean, it's only like anywhere else, only a tiny number of the population is involved in crime, but like any population, there's people that are involved in these things. And Chicago, along with Detroit and Brooklyn, is the primary immigration destination for people from Chinese, Sicily. That's the hub of the sort of community that was running pizzerias in southern Wisconsin down into northern Illinois. They're in these rural areas, small towns, which are good places. And with the FBI actually and other federal investigators, I had some documents and maps from them. They actually said that what was happening, of course, they're bringing stuff into rural pizzerias in the Midwest, probably because it's not on the radar of drug enforcement and stuff, right? They're not bringing it into like the middle of the west side of Chicago, where there's already drug agents and everything running around, right? They're bringing it into these rural pizzerias, and then they said that they were redistributing it back to New York, and then from New York they were supplying Philly, Chicago, New Jersey, and Detroit. So Chicago was absolutely part of the pizza connection network at that level, right? And now, who was actually in charge of dealing it? At what level were made members involved? Is a matter of controversy and speculation. But there's informants the FBI has from the early 1970s to the 80s that members were bankrolling it. That they were capital.
Like Tommy Dell in Philadelphia, he said that Philadelphia had a rule against dealing drugs. We know there was a national rule the commission issued about dealing drugs, but Philadelphia got around it by giving loans to drugs. What they were actually doing is financing it. They knew where the money was going, but they could use plausible deniability to say, I'm just giving these guys loans. I didn't know that I was financing
on it. Yeah. I just want my points on my juice. That's all I care about, right? Yeah, but they know what they're doing. And so I believe it's in the 80s that several members of the Carlisi crew, the 80s and the 90s, we're covering so much different territory, right? But law enforcement had surveilled several members of the Carlisi crew, meeting with known like major drug dealers while they were surveilling them for some drug busts. So the idea was that they were whether they're offering them protection from law enforcement, right? They're charging them street tax, right? They're the same way that they had lots of bookmakers who weren't even associates necessarily of the mafia, but who were under their aegis, they were under their protection and paid for that by paying them street tax, right? People often talk about street tax as if it's extortion. In some cases it is. In other cases, they're sort of offering some level of services, right? We can protect you from getting robbed. We can protect you from cops, right? We have crooked cops, and we can let you know when they're going to do a raid, right? In return, you pay us. You give us a percentage of your operation. It could be drugs, it could be prostitution, it could be bookmaking, it could be illegal business, right? Yeah. So there's a continuum between outright extortion, like it would be a shame if something were to happen to your store, right? And you're basically paying us because we're almost like a government of like the underworld or free market businesses, right?
Yeah.
That's yeah, and it by all accounts too. So by the 70s and the 80s, because of law enforcement pressure, both local law enforcement and heavy federal pressure, right? A lot of, especially juice, which in the East Coast they call shylocking. Chicago they tend to call it juice loans, right? They squeeze the points, they squeeze the juice out of you, right? But juice had been a huge money maker for a lot of guys in Chicago, right? And by the 70s and the 80s, it was becoming harder and harder to operate it. Another thing that Scarpelli tells the feds in his 302s is that basically the Ferriola crew was almost entirely out of juice loans. Like they weren't even, they were mostly involved, he says, in gambling and in basically street tax payments from operations, independent operations, right?
Yeah.
Because juice was just it. Because the problem with juice is, a guy can go run to the police. People started doing that. It brings a lot of heat down, and it brings extortion charges, right? And those things could cause a lot of trouble. And going back to the 60s, we have repeated reports from FBI informants, right, in Chicago that it's getting harder and harder to maintain those rackets. So it looks like in the 80s, we have more extortion. We may have some guys, and this is also said by FBI informants, that more and more guys, members, were getting involved in drugs at different levels. They're looking for different ways to make money. Yeah. Some guys also got into legitimate business, which seems to be a route that Johnny DiFronzo sort of prioritized.
Yeah.
For outright owning or controlling a number of car dealerships.
Yeah. And that's something that Calabrese called out specifically in those recordings as well, was that DiFronzo and the members of his crew, I think he said, I don't remember the quote exactly, but it was something to the effect of DiFronzo set all his guys up with legitimate businesses. I think he mentioned Lee Magnifici. He mentioned Lefty Cacciatore. But I think the point was that he said DiFronzo, I think, indirectly did it the right way, is what how Calabrese described it. He set all of his guys up in legitimate businesses, and they really had fronts. So I don't know how much. Yeah,
white collar racketeering. So people also then think, well, that means the mafia doesn't exist anymore, because they think the mafia is just juice loans or narcotics or extortion or gambling, right? But just like in the 1920s, the mafia was not just a bootlegging syndicate. That's one thing they did in that period. They've always owned legitimate businesses. And it's not like the Sopranos where they're like locusts and they come in just to bust the place out. I mean, we've known members of the mafia all over the place, right? Sicily in the U.S., who are physicians, teachers, politicians, have college educations, right? These are not just.
I mean, when Tommaso Buscetta was made, he found out that a member of the Porto Nova family was a clinical psychiatrist.
Yeah. Well, in Chicago, we had older members that were, we're talking about well into the 20th century, right? Who were one of them, Joe Ferriola, was a member of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and then little Joe Aiello, who seems to have been a relative of the notorious Joe Aiello. He was a member up until through the 70s when he died. He was a member of the Northside crew, right? Little Joe Aiello was the head of a Laborers International Union. He was a business agent, right? And he was also the head of the Bagades Paisani Society, the San Giuseppe di Bagaria Society. So these were guys that were important. I mean, they weren't talking about any criminal activities. This was a guy that was a leader in the civic community, and the Italian community, was a leader in organized labor, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't out there breaking people's kneecaps for 2 points on a loan or something, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a social element that, I don't mean to deviate too much from Chicago, but there's a social element of Cosa Nostra that I think a lot of people disregard, where, there's certainly a lot of them that deal in the criminal element and make the majority of their income from that, but there's also a significant portion of them in the past and the present who derive most of their income from legitimate sources, and they use more of the social aspect of Cosa Nostra now. And I'm certain they still get a piece of the illegal aspect of it, but the social aspect of it can't be disregarded in both past and present.
It exists to create and to expand opportunities for its membership. Those opportunities could be through illegal rackets. Those opportunities could be through political favors. Those opportunities could be through a favorable business climate. And I think this is just the DiFronzo sort of vision seems to have been something that's actually very old in the Mafia, which was always present in Chicago. It just didn't get the media attention, but to have, legitimate businesses. And you could do things like there could be white collar racketeering. You could be doing kickbacks, right? You can be doing you can get sort of sweetheart contracts if you have connections, especially in the suburban governments, things like that, right? But you can also form sort of like cartel monopolies unofficially, right? By acting with other affiliated businesses, right? You can do potential business with each other. We know that for decades, the mafia in the U.S., Chicago was involved in this, the Bonanos, the California families, Philly, all over the place. Basically, controlled the production and distribution of Italian cheese.
Yeah.
A huge deal.
I think that what I've discovered digging deep into the Sicilian mafia, the origins of the U.S. mafia, is the idea was to have a hold in as many resources as possible, not just criminal resources. I mean, it's all corrupt. It's all designed to benefit Cosa Nostra and its membership. But, you had a Bonanno member who was a high school band leader and music teacher. And these aren't just one-offs. You might not have 100 guys like that. But the idea is any industry, any profession, and when you've dug into some of the stuff we've dug into, they were pretty much everything except police. There were multiple doctors made in New York, for example, and that wasn't ancient history. That was into the 60s, into the 70s. So this idea that going legitimate is somehow like straying from what the mafia is not, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
It obviously is a criminal organization. A big component of it is breaking the law, but that's not the whole of it, And so when you hear about groups like DiFronzo's guys going legitimate, that's actually more traditional in many ways than it is not. It might be different from the Chicago outlaws and gangsters that we think of, but it really is what they've always done.
Yeah. They've always had members like that. And that's another thing that Frank Calabrese Sr. tells his son in the tapes, right, is that there's always sleepers. We always have sleepers that the government doesn't know about.
Yeah.
Right. So then, this was something that's really important. I mean, Joey Antiochi, some people call him Joey the Builder, right? You see that like in some, like press reports and that kind of stuff, right? I mean, he had a lot of interest in real estate. These are legitimate. They're not fronts. They're not like fake businesses. This guy is really building stuff. But you can imagine because of his connections, he's able to get certain preferential access to things, treatment.
Yeah.
Also, at different levels, this provides a sort of preferential playing field for people who are part of the system.
Yeah.
And then in Italy, of course, aside from narcotics, right, this is a major activity of all of the different mafia groups.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, these guys are not believers in the invisible hand of the free market, even if they're the business, right? Again, it's opportunity within their network for each other.
In Chicago, the induction of quote unquote legitimate politicians, John Dalton, Vito Marzulli. There's others as well who have all been identified. Joe Gold, who was a mayor and a lawyer. That's what we see in the Sicilian mafia, where important politicians have been made. There's a whole list of them I could go down. We know in recent years the Bonanos made an important politician in Montreal. There's many situations, but Chicago did exactly that. They inducted politicians because what better resource is there than politics?
Well, Frank Stronghi Sortino, who went by Frank Ferraro, right? He used an alias. He was the underboss under Giancana, who was like one of the most sort of stereotypical Chicago criminal mafiosi you can think of, right? Just to show the way that doesn't represent all the membership. So Frank Ferraro, who dies in '64, was Giancana's underboss. He had never been convicted of a crime. He lives in a high rise in the lakefront. He walks around with a poodle. The guy has a suit like so Giancana, but this guy dressed like like an affluent businessman, right? He didn't have the comportment of a gangster. He had no criminal record, And this is a guy, during a period when there was intense federal law enforcement scrutiny coming down to Chicago, right? This guy they find out he's the underboss of the family, right? This guy has no conviction record, right? It's not a person that's again out there breaking people's kneecaps and terrorizing people over juice loans, right? So, and he's the number 2 guy in the family's chain of command, right? And is primarily involved in political corruption and sort of clout, sort of power in the Chicago City Hall, right? This is important. I mean, we've identified, we won't get into them now, but we've identified over the years a number of these sort of sleeper members, right? Some of, many of whom have no criminal convictions. There was a guy, Phil Ponce, that was identified as a Chicago made member who died in the 80s. He was described as having the bearing of a heart surgeon. And he ran the Stardust Casino as a made member of the Chicago Mafia for about 15 years. And so it finally came out, that he was identified by Jimmy Fradiano as a made member.
Yeah.
So this is nothing new, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to drop back to a little bit ago. I was just thumbing through Nick Calabrese's testimony, and I just wanted to mention what he said about being shelved. They asked him, was there a status within the outfit that was called, I guess in the vernacular, to be put on the shelf? And he said, yes, I heard that term before. They said, what does that mean? It means you're told not to do anything. You're not to do any kind of illegal activity at all. In other words, they're just putting you on the shelf and you sit there, rather than maybe you did something wrong and it doesn't warrant you being killed, so they just shelve you. They asked, are you terminated from the outfit? And he said, no. You're still a member? And he said, yes. And they asked, and are you still obligated to perform activities on behalf of the outfit if called upon? And he said, yes. So I think that's just interesting. It's the exact same description of being shelved that you would hear everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring that up too, because I think when we hear that, DiFronzo's guys went legitimate, I think there's an assumption that, they're shelved, or, they're disconnected from the outfit, when that's not necessarily the case at all. But the family did have formal shelving as we know it everywhere. I find that interesting.
Very serious thing in the Mafia, right? Like, so a good friend of our show, Michael DiLeonardo, has talked to us about this before, right? And we also know it from all sorts of other sources, right? I mean, this is the last call before they take you out feet first, right? This is something where instead of killing you, they've basically given you a form of social death, where you're not allowed to be involved in sort of mafia activities. They also tell members to stay away from you, right? Which is important because this goes back to the Frank and Frank prison tape, right? Where it looks like they're saying basically Joey Andriacchi wasn't supposed to be talking to Joey Lombardo because he was on the shelf, right? It's like almost like a form of social death or ostracization, right?
The living dead.
Yeah, it is. If they want to give you an order, they can still do that. You're still subject to them, because when you're made, it's there's no way out. Even guys who flip technically are still members, right? There's no. That's another thing too. When you see like, so and so's a member, but he's retired. Even guys in that life might talk about that. It's fuzzy, because from a formal perspective, there's no retirement.
Yeah.
Right? They mean is this guy's no longer actively part of a sort of criminal network.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe he has garnered enough respect over the years that they allow him to, move to Florida and retire or what have you. But yeah, if they really wanted to call him back into action and do something for them, he would be obligated to do so.
You belong to them for life and even afterwards, because oath, right? Maybe been held.
What's so funny is in the Colombo boss Tom DeBella's FBI file, if you go through it chronologically, at one point they say, we're closing Tom DeBella's file because we've determined he's inactive. The next year he becomes the boss. It's just funny how that works. Like, inactive is more or less an outsider term. Obviously within the Mafia, there is a certain level of activity, but still, like, that's kind of our perception is retirement activity. It's like when Mario Gigante died and Jerry Capisi said he was semi-retired, and he was like 98, ancient,
That's the thing, is it can be fuzzy, right? So you have to mean, does this mean it from an operational perspective, as we would put it, with the show, or an organizational perspective? From an organizational perspective, there's no retirement. You belong to them forever, right?
Yeah.
But from an operational perspective, right? Yeah, you could be essentially de facto retired in the sense that you're no longer active in any sort of activity. Maybe you're not even active socially, right? But you're always a member, right? And it's interesting because there's also guys, just files I've looked through for this is kind of jumping ahead, but I guess we want to talk about Chicago Heights, because maybe there's less to say about them than some of these other crews, right?
Yeah.
So jumping all the way down instead. Sorry to do that to everybody. We went away from the counterclockwise. But, older members of this crew, right? Sam DiGiovanni, Phil Bacino, right? Of this crew, or this is kind of a complicated thing, right? But we think that there may have been more than one crew. It might have been as many as 3 crews up until the 60s. And the south suburbs, Calumet, Northwest Indiana, Illinois border region, right? We have strong reason to believe that there was at least 2 crews down there until the 1960s, right? We don't have any evidence after that continued. So it's possible that those were consolidated into one crew, right? But they had these older members, Sicilian members like Bill Bacino and Sam DiGiovanni and Nick DiGiovanni, and these guys were the FBI closed their file because they go around, they talk to local law enforcement, they do some surveillance, and like all these guys do is call a bunch of other people from Sicily from their hometown on their phones, and everyone says they're very well respected, and they used to be involved in gambling or bootlegging, but they're retired now, they're no longer active, right? These could be some of the most important members of the mafia who are maintaining social networks, who are talking to people, right? Sometimes in Sicily, sometimes in other parts of the country, right? But the FBI closes their file, and we don't learn anything about them in the years after that because the FBI is not interested in it from an anthropological perspective for the most part, like we are. They're interested in building cases. So for their purposes, person's retired, right? Because they're not active in any sort of criminal.
Yeah.
Build a case.
Yeah, they're looking for criminal activity exclusively. Yep. But from the 80s on, they're looking pretty exclusively for criminal activity.
Yep. So I'd say the south suburban, Calumet border region area is a very interesting area. Another area, like the north side, right? By the time we're talking about in the 80s into the 90s, the mafia has really declined sharply.
Yeah, significantly weakened.
Yeah. Chicago Heights, the suburban town of Chicago Heights had a very large Italian population. A lot of the neighboring areas going all the way east into Gary, which is very close to Chicago. These are all basically suburbs of Chicago, right? This whole area used to have significant Italian population because of demographic change, and because it was one of the world premier concentrations of steel production, right? This is the Rust Belt, right? This is the Rust Belt of Chicago. So this whole area from Northwest Indiana into South suburban Cook County and the southeast side of Chicago by the 70s, is really declining economically.
Yeah.
Huge. A lot of people leave. You go to these places today, a lot of them are very economically depressed, right? The old towns that used to have Italian populations and other ethnic groups like Polish and Balkan and so forth, and Greek that used to do a lot of gambling and a lot of juice loans, right? These populations left. There's no money, and they've sort of, at least until recently, sort of kind of got left out of time. You go to places like Gary. I mean, for decades it was one of the most violent and rundown cities in the country, right? Chicago Heights, in my opinion, is not much better. No offense to anybody who lives there. I went there recently, and it's, doesn't look like it's gotten any better over the years. There's a reason why these places declined in importance, right? Demographically and economically, they're not, it's not what it used to be. Kind of like places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, where during the same time period, the mafia families there declined. For part of the same reason, I think, right? There's a lot less economic activity, and there's less money for people to spend on things that the mafia tends to have interest in. So that's to say, by the 80s, there's definitely a huge decline. Franco Pincero, I think in the early 70s, was very close to the captain of this crew at that time, the Chicago Heights crew, Frank Laporte. He says the Laporte had about 25 to 30 men reporting to him, which presumably is including important associates as well as members, right? But it may have been one of the largest crews, if not the largest crew in Chicago. And we know it was actually originally its own family. And there were actually 2 families. There was a family in Chicago Heights and there was a family in Gary. And sometime between the 1920s and 1930s, those families got absorbed into the Chicago family. So that's just a quick background, right? This is a large region, used to be very, very active economically, a lot of immigrant groups there. By the 70s and 80s, much more economically depressed. And what used to be a very active mafia environment has really declined. There's some guys running around, there's some members, they're still making guys in 83, right? Don Palermo was identified by Nick Calabrese as the captain.
Yeah.
Nick Palermo. We know, as far as we know, he succeeded Al Palato.
Yeah.
But also the president of the local, of the Laborers International Union.
Yeah, Palato had been in prison since about 82, I think, 82 or 83 at that point. And he was actually shot
Yep.
In 82, I believe, 81 or 82. I know he was indicted in 81. I think he was shot in 82. Attempted assassination. I think it was. I know there's been some theories that it was Al Taco who was sort of. He initiated some type of plot to take Pilato out so he could take the crew over. But I think the consensus now is, especially after Calabrese was involved in some of the murders with the guys who were behind that assassination attempt, that it was really some type of plot by independent associates and not members to take out Pilato so they could consolidate their hold on the territory independent of the outfit, at least from what I can gather.
Which could be an index also of the fact that the mob had really become a lot weaker than it had been.
Yeah, and I think they used Taco's name to sort of add some legitimacy to that. But even then, Taco, he wasn't made at that point. So
he could take over. He couldn't take over the crew as a captain. He wasn't even a member yet. He wasn't made until he which people didn't really know that back then, right? So
that's true. Yeah,
around, right?
Yeah. So, Pilato, there was an attempted assassination on a golf course. He survived. He went to prison.
Yep.
Dominic Tootsie Palermo, presumed took over. At least he was in charge of the crew, whether it was a full-time or an acting basis.
Yep.
We do know that he did sponsor Al Taco and Nicholas Casino into the outfit, according to Nicholas Calabrese in 1983. There's some conflicting information as to what happened after that. And even prior to that, I do have some files that were released in the early 90s that say that actually Frank Zizzo succeeded Pilato as capo of Chicago Heights. Zizzo died in 86. And after that, Palermo and Taco split, with Palermo taking Northwest Indiana and Taco taking Southern Cook County, Will County, Chicago Heights area.
Problem is Nick Calabrese doesn't say that, and Nick Calabrese was on a hit with Frank Zizzo and was told he was a member by somebody.
Yeah,
he knew that he was Little Tony Zizzo's father, who was a member of the crew. And he specifically said that Palermo was the captain, and that's why Palermo was present at the '83 ceremony.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, that information was early 90s, so it precedes Calabrese's information. Now, what we don't know is if Taco was officially the sole capo, or whether they had whether the outfit had some kind of arrangement where he and Palermo split duties, because Scarpelli does say that the crew belonged to Taco. Yep. So I do know that Palermo had some health issues in the 70s and 80s. So maybe it was that he didn't want to be full-time capo. Yep. But then when Taco was imprisoned in 89, maybe Palermo did become full-time capo. We don't know, but.
Well, this is by 88 too. So, I mean, by this time, Al Taco had been made for 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So by that time, he does qualify to be bumped up to captain, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So it's conceivable that he could have been capo at that point. And of course, he went to prison in 89. Yeah. And then Palermo succeeded him. But what we do know is by at least 90, by the time of Palermo's imprisonment, that the crew was pretty much defunct, and the FBI themselves had stated that there was very little criminal activity, at least criminal activity which was formerly associated with the outfit, going on by the early 90s. And since then, in the 30 years, since then, there's been little formal activity which has been tied to the outfit, at least as far as there being an independent crew is concerned.
Yeah, there's rumors that there's connected guys or even made guys down there. In Indiana and in like the south suburbs, there's rumors that they report to the Chinatown crew. So the 90s. I have no strong opinion either way because we just don't have evidence for it.
But as far as their existence as an independent crew, as far as we can tell, that ceased by the early 90s. Yeah, by the early 90s at the latest. So
Taco goes on. He actually flees the country and goes to Greece. His estranged wife Betty testifies against him and says that he told her about his role that he played in the disposal of the bodies of Tony and Mike Spilotro.
Yeah.
And Palermo were tasked with that, right? And we know that those bodies were discovered in a cornfield, because they weren't buried deep enough. Even though the story of how they got killed wasn't actually revealed until Family Secrets by Calabrese.
Yeah.
right? The guys from Chicago Heights were tasked with the disposal of it, and apparently got in a little bit of trouble because they fucked that up.
Yeah.
You can bleep that out. But his estranged wife testifies against him after they haul him back to the U.S. from Greece, where he was trying to hide out. 91, also one of the last figures that we think of any importance that could have been made was Bernard Snooky Morgano. Snooky Morgano, I believe in 90, he's indicted. 91, I think they convicted him and a few other guys.
Yeah.
Sicilian guys like him, Sam Luzo, and I think in Merrillville, and San Glorioso. And like Snooky Morgano, San Glorioso had ancestry from Calabrese, which Tony Pinelli may have been a captain over Gary. We have reason to believe that Gary, which we also have reason to believe was an independent family up until probably 1935, when the guy who seems to have been the boss, Paulo Palazzolo from Chinisi, was killed. We think at that point it was probably folded into Chicago as a crew. And, by the 80s, at least the 70s and the 80s, it would seem that the members and associates in Northwest Indiana seemed to be answering to the LaPorte Palotto crew in Chicago Heights. But before that, Pinelli, who was a Sicilian guy from Calashibeta, who was based in the city of Chicago, around the 1950s moved his operations. He had a pizzeria in Gary, but then also he was living in Sierra Madre, California, and operating another example. The FBI described him as operating an octopus of legitimate businesses and investments, but he was using as a money laundering engine for the Chicago Mafia. And he was identified by LA members as a member of the Chicago Mafia through about 1965.
And then he transferred to LA, and then his son was married to the daughter of Phil Amari, the boss of the DeCavalcantes, and his son was later made with the LA family. He's a fascinating character too, because he's explicitly identified as a Capodicina of the Chicago family. It's just a question. Yeah, it's just a question though of whether was this just a Gary crew, or was it, like I think Mark was saying earlier, there was a heavy geographic component, but it wasn't all based around geography, so there's a lot of questions related to that.
But a lot of guys moved down there, right? And that's interesting also. A lot of guys, almost all Sicilian guys from the city of Chicago, moved to Calumet City, Hammond, and Calumet City is in Illinois, Hammond is in Indiana. They're literally across the street from each other. So again, all this Indiana stuff we're talking about, we're not talking about Indianapolis, we're talking about the Chicago land part of Indiana, right? And, Gary, East Chicago, Hammond, Merrillville, right? And, this is a territory, at least from 1930s onwards, of the Chicago mob, right? We just don't know what the crew structure exactly was. Tony Pinelli is identified as being an important capo of the Chicago family, who around 65 transferred his membership to LA because he was getting old and he could no longer handle his responsibilities as a captain. So that tells us he was a captain as late as about the 60s, probably late 50s.
And then, as we've talked about off the show, but then, Joe Costello, who was the son of an early Chicago Heights, son and nephew of early Chicago Heights powers. There's a wiretap of him talking to Giancana where it's clear that he uses the term Capodicina. He has a Capodicina who's not Frank LaPorte.
Yep.
But he's based in Chicago Heights. And then the FBI had reason to believe, based on wiretaps, that Sam DiGiovanni had been a Capodicina, or still was possibly. They couldn't confirm it, but they believed there was a reference to an old-time capo who was, they believed was Sam DiGiovanni. So like you were saying, there may have been multiple crews. They may have had members that didn't all live in that area too. Or if a guy lived in that area, he didn't necessarily report to a local. There's a lot of variables at play here. And then something I wanted to mention too is that Chicago Heights seems to have had a lot of influence in Phoenix, Arizona. I've shared this with you, Tony, but an FBI report from, I believe, the mid or late 70s refers to Joe Tocco, the brother of Al, as the boss of Phoenix, and it lists a bunch of Chicago members under him. Joe Tocco's never even been identified as a member, yet the FBI is calling him basically the LCN boss of Phoenix, which we know is nonsense.
They have a ton of redacted names on there. We have no idea who they're talking about. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. Now, most of those names are not going to be members.
That's Al Tucco's brother too,
Yeah,
right?
Joe Tucco. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a big deal. And I would wager that he was made before his brother, but we don't know it, right? And we don't know that for a fact. And it's he seems to have been, at least from his stature. But there's a lot going on in both California as well as Arizona and Vegas, right? And because Tony Spilotro is a very famous person, right? This is sort of kind of overshadows the lesser known elements. Frank Buccieri was on the West Coast. He was a member that made in late 60s, late 70s, maybe, right? Frank Buccieri was Fifi Buccieri's brother, but he wasn't made. He might have been made after his brother died.
Yeah, it was. I think there's some files in the 80s that said he's a suspected member. I don't know if he was ever confirmed as a member post.
He wasn't when his brother was alive. I'm pretty sure. I think there's actually this confirmatory evidence.
I mean, you also have Vito Spallone in Los Angeles, who relocated from Chicago, and I think he was identified as a suspected LCN member as well.
Yeah, he was running a large. He basically went out to L.A. A bunch of Chicago guys seem to have gone out to L.A. in the 70s and early 80s. And what law enforcement said from investigations was that they were attempting to basically take over and restart sort of traditional mob type rackets like loan sharking and extortion and gambling, because prominent Brook leader, the administration of the Elliott family got knocked down by the feds, and Elliott family was in a sort of weak point at this time and had very little control over sort of traditional kind of mob rackets. And so Chicago, some of the New York families moved in and started doing this stuff, but the evidence is that Chicago was basically trying to do a wholesale takeover and move the number of operatives, whether members or associates, out there to do this. And in the 80s, some of these guys got knocked by the government also, and because they were running around LA like it was Chicago, storing businessmen and threatening guys over points on juice loans, and people ran to the governments. Yeah. But they have nasty people out there. It's funny, right? But they were doing this in Phoenix. They had people in Tucson. We identified, through FBI documents, a member and a suspected member that were otherwise unknown to us in Tucson, who had connections to Joe Bonanno's sort of erstwhile wannabe, mafia family, where he was shelved, but he was trying to get back in, right? He was trying to get back into Chicago in the 70s. One of the ones trying to get Chicago as a commission member to advocate for him and his Tucson quote unquote family to be reinstated in the LCN network. It's funny, right? But so there's a lot of stuff happening. Chicago Heights had Johnny Roselli, very famous LA member that transferred to Chicago, right? Assigned to him. So even though he's down there in this sort of extremely working class blue collar area on the fringes of Chicago itself, right? He has members in other states answering to him.
Frank Vidalbo, who transferred out of Milwaukee due to factional warfare, he ended up reporting to Frank Laporte.
Yeah,
and the graphic thing I was just saying, where it's like the Chicago Heights crew under Laporte had a member in Southern California and a member in Milwaukee, and Chicago Heights isn't the most obvious. It doesn't make sense. Like, it's not the closest crew to Milwaukee by any means. It's the furthest.
Geographically and historically, like Galbo and a bunch of other Milwaukee members had very close ties to the North Side crew because that crew was almost entirely Sicilian, right? And also had lots of ties to like the Battaglia crew, to Alderizio, Tony Accardo, because he was Sicilian, right? They had these ties to crews on the North Side and the Northwest Side, right? In terms of the membership, in terms of contacts, visits, there's a lot of back and forth activity between Milwaukee and Chicago. Little to none of it seems to involve the Chicago Heights crew, right? But for whatever reason, Galbo is assigned to Laporte. So this also goes to speak to, as you said, the ways the geography was not always deterministic. So just because Pinelli was clearly based in Gary, that doesn't mean his whole crew was. He was based in California and then was constantly flying in and out to Gary through the 50s and into the early 60s, I believe, according to FBI surveillance. His file is very interesting, right? He was definitely up to stuff in Gary, even though he was ostensibly a wealthy, legit businessman in California, right? And they said that, they were law enforcement was trying to, tie a bunch of, juice loans, gambling, narcotics, even in Gary. Like his group in Gary seems to have been the guys running all of organized crime in Gary, right?
Yeah.
Into the early 60s, but we don't, I mean, was his crew, did it have members in California? Were Chicago members? Members in the north side of the city or other parts of the city where a lot of Sicilians lived? Or were they only in Indiana, Calumet City, right? We don't really know.
Yeah. And I mean, the Heights.
Yeah.
I was going to say the Heights, they have a lot of similarity with the North Side crew in that the rackets were drying up. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the North Side crew, where there really wasn't a lot of indictments aside from Joe DeVarco, the Heights crew was really decimated by indictments. You had Taco went down in '89. Palermo, Nicholas Casino, and Bernard Morgano were all indicted and imprisoned in 1990. With them all serving significant. Palermo and Morgano both died in prison, and Casino didn't make it out of prison until 10 or 12 years after that. The members, well, we don't know if there were members left after that. I mean, you have a couple of suspected members, Al Roviaro, Al Rossetti, those were suspected to be members, but when Palermo went away, they were both in their late 70s, early 80s. They were pretty old. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that entire crew was decimated and the remaining members were either in prison or elderly by that point. And there was really nothing left by the early 90s. So the crew was either considered defunct or they're absorbed or reported up to Chinatown or what have you.
We don't really know. There's different rumors. There's different possibilities. We're not going to take a strong position on these things. I think we all have an open mind, right? It can go a number of different ways. There's so little firm information, right? Yeah, Morgano's father, we also don't know what his position was because he seems to have been a captain also.
Yeah.
But
there's Tommy Morgano, right?
Yeah, Gaetano, Tommy Morgano,
right?
Gaetano Tommy Morgano was another Sicilian guy from the city of Chicago who around early 1950s, relocated to Gary. Just seems like out of the blue, right? And it's not a place that you would just relocate to from Chicago for no reason, right? So it's funny. A bunch of these guys came down there, right? And he was from Calabrese in Enna, from the same town as Tony Pinelli. And in 1959, in the 50s, he was identified as an important, hoodlum or mafioso in the area, right? And in 1959, he was under a deportation order from the immigration authorities. But it wasn't executed. He left, quote unquote, voluntarily with his wife, whose family was actually from Agrigento province, right? And he went back to Sicily of his own will, but then was reported to have been meeting with Chicago members in Mexico in the 60s.
Yeah. So
he was, one of these guys that seems like he was still involved. Who knows if he was involved with the mafia in Sicily, presumably he would have kept strong ties back to his hometown, which again was Pinelli's hometown. So yeah, Morgano, who's his son, Bernard Snooky Morgano. I think it was a huge guy, like 300 pounds or something. This guy, he stays in Gary and Northwest Indiana, Lake County, Indiana. And in the early 90s, he's given a 10-year or 8-year sentence or something, or I forgot what it was.
He dies in prison, I believe, about 96, 97, something like that.
Yeah.
And then they out of prison, but
yeah. I mean, he might have been a member. If he was probably one of the last ones there. Like I said, there's Sam Glorioso that was busted with him, who also has ancestry from Calabrese. He might have, who knows, if an associate or what he was, but there at least was a few associates around him. It seems like, and what they were busted for, extorting bookies and stuff, keeping Gary and other places and running gambling operations.
It was mostly sports book, extortion, street tax, things like that. Houses, I think there were some houses of prostitution, and they met at the Taste of Italy, I think, which was in Calumet City, if I remember correctly, but I'm not.
They were reported meeting. It was in Cali. They were reported meeting in Calumet City by an associate who wore a wire. If I'm not mistaken. I forgot which one. Yeah.
So we've got 3 more crews left, and these crews are pretty significant in status and importance as well. So I don't know if we want to make this a 2-parter or
I think we should.
I mean, we've got Melrose Park, Cicero, and Chinatown. I think all three of those crews play a very important role in this time period. So if this is one we can split up into two, I think it would be a good candidate to do so, because there's still a lot of really important stuff that I don't want to give short shrift to. So what say you guys?
Yeah.
We're going on. We just hit 3 hour mark. So
I know we were long winded, just for the audience.
Yeah.
This show developed, we're all friends and like collaborators, right? And colleagues, right? And this show developed out of us holding 5-hour long phone talks and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
About things, right? And we kind of wanted
text threads, just bullshit.
The thing is, there's so much information, right? And Chicago's a major family that has a lot of information that hasn't really made it out to the public.
Yeah.
Right. And I already know that for some of these things, people are going to be like, oh, you didn't bring this up. You didn't bring that up. Right. Because people who are aficionados are going to say, you forgot about this case, or you forgot when this guy got pinched or something. Right. We're trying to 3 hours, and I feel like we're kind of just scraping the surface.
I think you guys have been talking about the 90s, and you're talking about like Chicago Heights in the 1930s. But I mean, that's what we do. It's like, this makes me think of that, which here's the historical context. Here's,
it's important. It's important that Morgano, the Snooki Morgano, is the son of Gaetano Morgano, who's deported to Sicily or self-deports to Sicily in the early 60s. And they're from the same town as Tony Pinelli, who's also identified as a captain, right? And is a really important person. And some of the guys working for them as late as the 90s have ancestry from that town.
Yeah.
Just like a lot of the other guys in Chicago Heights who are Sicilian have ancestry from Cacamo, or from Palazzo Adriano, some other towns that are important in the history of the Mafia and like the Chicago area, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's important to know that context when it comes to some of these guys. Also, we don't know who's watched our previous episodes and things like that. So I think it is important to give a little bit of context for those who may be coming into this fresh or unknowing of our past or not having watched our previous episodes too. So, but yeah, we still got Melrose Park, Cicero, West Side / Taylor Street crew, Chinatown crew, and all three of those crews tie in really importantly to the leadership and the structure of the outfit during this time period. So I would hate to have to burn through those three in the time, and what we could potentially have remaining. So
yeah, it's really important. I think that people would probably agree that whatever has existed, and it still exists, right? Even though, again, we're not a journalistic. I mean, it still exists, and it seems from a lot of accounts that what exists is essentially they got sort of truncated into a group on the north side that's mostly based around Elmwood Park and Grand Avenue, and a group on the south side, right? Even though they might actually be in the suburbs and they might not really be north and south, right?
Yeah.
Historically, a north side group and then a south side group that is mostly Cicero, Melrose Park, and Chinatown, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is sort of when we talk about things like Chicago Heights and the north side, the next step, I mean, if we did a later episode of Family Secrets, this stuff really doesn't come out anymore.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, these crews by the early 90s or the late 90s at the very latest are gone, right? Yeah. Right. And because so much of the operations and so much of the demographics has moved out to the suburbs. And these things are now getting remixed, and it's a new environment, right? A lot of law enforcement scrutiny. It's a different world to negotiate. They also lose their power to corrupt in the city of Chicago in the Cook County court system, which we didn't even talk about. Those are
we haven't even talked about the first ward yet. So I think there's still a lot to talk about.
Yep. So we can do that next time, and we could probably even push into like around 2000 or something, right? Which makes sense.
Oh yeah.
One is when Johnny Apes dies, right? So
yeah, because I think there's some logical transitions we can make from that point on. So we could almost finish this out and then kind of move into the early part, pre-Family Secrets, since some of that is still public knowledge and is well-known information, not really a lot of conjecture. So
yeah, and if people post any questions, and it's something that we're not able to answer, on the comments section, if it's something we can get to in an episode, you have a really burning question about something substantial related to Chicago that we brought up or we didn't address for this time period, post-Aiuppa, right? Maybe it's something we can also address in the next episode,
Yeah. Or our conclusion is going to be, we're going to tell the audience the name of every single current living Chicago member, every activity they're involved in, and every week.
Yeah, no comment.
Yeah, Reddit Mafia, get ready. We're about to give you the up-to-date list for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's if nothing else, I mean, you learn how, again, fraught and impartial even evidence on the best known periods in Chicago is, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's conflicting information from FBI sources and court records.
Yep.
You know, there's FBI records that conflict each other. There are court records that conflict with FBI, vice versa. It's very difficult to parse out what's 100% a fact and what isn't a fact. I can only point to what I know, you know, and what I deem to be a reliable source. So,
yeah, I mean, unless another member testifies before the next show comes out, you know, which probably ain't going to happen. A lot of guys took what they knew to the grave with them.
Yeah.
The guys did hard time and never flipped. That's another thing, you know.
And that's our approach is, you know, providing analysis of the known information. It's very difficult with this subject. You know, the more you get into it, the harder it is to just list out black and white facts. Like Mark said, you know, there's stuff that there's families, people involved in this stuff that I know like the back of my hand, and I still don't feel confident saying things definitively. You know, it's just the nature of the subject.
Yeah. And any conjecture that I try to avoid conjecture and what if scenarios and maybe scenarios, but if I do venture down that path, I try to use supporting documentation as my reasoning for why I believe this to be so. And I'm even making conjecture about things 30 to 35, 40 years ago that in, you know, a normal historical subject, you wouldn't have to make conjecture about, because theoretically you would have most of the available source information for you. But for something like this, where it's a secret society and you only get what comes out in court documents and what little FBI records there are available in the past 30 years, it makes it very difficult to make definitive statements on things. So,
yeah, this is and it's the secret society part is really important also, right? I mean, obviously, this is what informs our perspective, because we see Chicago as a distinct local permutation of a larger phenomenon, as all of these other families were also, right? So you have to understand the larger mafia phenomenon, the way it takes root in different communities in different cities in the U.S., right? And the character is different, right? You go to Madison, Wisconsin, the membership is 100% Sicilian. Well, that's because the Italian community is like 95% Sicilian in Madison. They didn't even have any Napolitan to make if they wanted to, right? Right. So, you go to Chicago, Boston, or New York, and then the membership looks different. It represents an Italian community where Sicilians are interacting with mainland Italians, right? For at this point now, well over 100 years, right? Yeah. So we try to pay attention to both the local, the sort of local dynamic, as well as then contextualizing this, right? Because it's also a lot of Chicago stuff tends to happen in a silo where people discuss it with almost as if it has no relation to anything outside of it. Yeah. This is a family that we should remind the audience also, again, this is a family that had basically a constituent membership on the commission, along with the 5 New York families, from when the commission was formed in 1931. Chicago did not revolve on the commission the way other families did. Like New York, they were an essential part of it, right? And, as far as the commission existed, at least in a really formal form, right, up until the 1980s, this was true, right? This is, something to keep in mind. There's a lot of local dynamics. It was the second largest city in the country up until the 1980s. I remember actually being in school, and they announced over the school PA system when LA surpassed us in population. We had a moment of silence. But, for almost this entire history, this is the second largest city in the country we're talking about, right? Up until the period we're talking about, right? But, there's lots of connections. And because Italians and Sicilians moved back and forth in communities with their paesani all over the country, over and over again, you're going to see people that have relatives that have connections to people in different families. Some of this comes from racket cooperation, but a lot of it actually comes from the dynamics of where these different communities settled in the U.S., right? Yeah. So this is an important window into these things.
And I don't even know. I guess it's easy to understate how important Nick Calabrese's testimony and cooperation was to understanding Chicago as a mafia family, because, first of all, I don't even know if I'd be even here right now talking about it or even interested in it in general if I didn't become interested in it from that whole case and the national news that it made. And second of all, I think there'd still be a significant amount of people talking about how, well, Chicago isn't even a real mafia family. They don't make people. Things like that. Even though, as you just got done discussing, there's been evidence for decades that they were charter members of the commission.
Yep.
Back in the 30s, but yet somehow between now and then, if Calabrese hadn't come out and testified, people would still be thinking, well, they did away with that. They weren't really mafia. That was something they did away with long ago. They don't make people, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still difficult to even get a grasp on it, even with Calabrese's testimony, because he's just one member.
Yeah.
And some of these other families, people that research them, they're lucky enough to have several members who've cooperated to where you can get a much better understanding. But Chicago per capita made, from what we understand, many fewer members than other cities.
Yeah.
And they were very secretive, more so than a lot of people realize.
Yeah.
They took omerta seriously. They took it dead serious. Emphasis on dead.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You could tell just from Calabrese's, if you read the Calabrese transcripts, the prison transcripts between Frank and his son, there are instances they make or references to made guys, and Frank's very cagey and very evasive when he's talking about that. There's a couple of different times where he tells Junior, don't talk about that, don't mention that, don't say that, things like that, where he's mentioning things like a guy being made or something like that. And
in the late 90s,
Yeah, and Frank Calabrese is just not having any of it. He doesn't want to discuss it. And he doesn't think that his son should be discussing it either. Even when Frank Sr. is under the assumption that nobody else is hearing anything.
Yeah.
He doesn't know that Frank Jr.'s taping it, but he's under the assumption nobody else is hearing this, and he still doesn't want him talking about it. So
yeah, another thing from the Nick Calabrese testimony that I brought this up to you guys before, but it strikes me every time I sort of go back and reread this is that he discusses in detail his ceremony, which of course up until that point everybody who had an interest in the Chicago outfit would swear up and down they didn't have any ceremony, right? And they just never on record to talk about it, right? And he describes the ceremony in detail, and they asked him, when he was proposed for membership, did you know what this would entail? He says, no, I did not. Very short excerpt from the testimony, right? But to me, it's very telling because, again, the secret society.
yeah,
This is a guy who is, according to his own testimony, when he was made in '83, he was an associate, formally on record, first with Angelo LaPietra when he was a soldier, and by extension with LaPietra's captain at the time, right? Which first was Buccieri, then was Torello, right? And then later he's an associate direct with LaPietra when he's a captain, and then he gets proposed for membership. But he's an associate formally, like under a member for 13 years approximately. And he's an Italian guy who comes from, a very mobbed up neighborhood originally, right? We found evidence that people related to him were involved in sort of mafia type network activities back in the 20s and 30s around Grand Avenue, sort of cousins and so forth. They were all part of that world, right? And this was a person who he said he had no idea what the ceremony was. It's not like he was like, oh yeah, I had an idea they were going to prick my finger and they're going to do something, Like in New York, they have guys get made and they have parties in the corner bar back in the day, right? I mean, people in the neighborhood knew about when a guy got made. They weren't supposed to, I guess, technically, but people knew, right? Even civilians had an idea about this, right? Michael DiLeonardo talked about being a kid and having the dream of growing up and being a captain in the Gambino family.
Yeah.
And it's like, even their own children, even some of the ones that probably did get room for membership, I don't think had that sort of insight as kids,
Yeah, and some of these guys that cooperated, I think James LaValle was one of them, and maybe another guy where I think it was made known to him. I think Lenny Patrick told Jimmy LaValle, like, this guy's made, stay away from him. Like, don't get involved with this guy. So there were guys that understood the difference between being made and not, and being in the organization but not being made. They understood the discrepancy between the two.
Lenny Patrick definitely knew, right? And Lenny Patrick, he was a very important associate, of the Chicago Mafia going back for decades. And also, I read that as Lenny Patrick is trying to protect his own turf, essentially, his own, the guys working for him. He's not a member. If a member comes in and tries to steal one of his guys or take over one of the rackets, he knows that he, even as a powerful associate or respected associate, is going to not be put on the same level. That's because if they move against him, what's he going to do about it?
Yeah, well, that crew used money from the Melrose Park crew as their juice loan money. I mean, they got money from James Marcello and the Melrose Park crew to put on the streets. Yeah. Like, that was their bank to put money on the streets. So,
he knew that. He didn't want many guys coming around his workers, essentially, right? Yeah, that's why he's telling them to stay away, because he's like, if you get in trouble with those guys, what's he going to do to protect them?
Yeah, and it's the same thing with like
Lenny Patrick maybe do something, but they don't have to. They're not, they're beholden to do that. He's actually not one of them,
And then there's the other thing where Jimmy LaValle is talking to, I think it was Joe Vento, and Joe Vento was mentioning James Marcello, and LaValle said, "Yeah, I know he's somebody," and what Vento said, you effing better believe he's somebody. Like, he was somebody that was to be respected more than your average street guy. Which, my implication is that he was made, and at that point in time, probably running the Melrose Park crew. So. We'll
get into that in the next episode, but I agree.
And going back to the other thing of Scarpelli, he's got 18 pages of his 302 redacted, so we don't know if that's when he mentions a ceremony, but from what was released of the 302, he doesn't mention anything about a ceremony. We don't know whether that's because he's just being ultra secretive and not wanting to divulge that he was actually a member, in the hopes that, okay, maybe they won't come down to me as hard or ask me as many questions if they don't think that I'm a member, if they don't think that I'm a made member. Or it could be that, he was made and didn't want to tell him anything, or, maybe he did divulge details about that ceremony, they just didn't release it in what we have. So that's another interesting thing too to note, is that he didn't mention any of it that we know of.
I don't think he did, because those redactions, most of what they asked him about seemed to have been related to murders, because he was involved in a lot of murders. Him becoming a made member, right? That's most of what they were interested in, was that. I don't know if they even knew he was a member when they bust, because again, when they were doing all their surveillance and to do the sting on him, and they're using this guy Dookie Bazile, who was an associate, he wasn't a member. I don't think Bazile was in position to even know that he was a member.
Yeah, I mean, it could be they didn't know he was a member, or maybe they didn't suspect that he was a member, so they never had reason to ask him about this in the first place. And if they weren't going to ask him, most guys, they aren't going to tell. I mean, especially if it's not like a murder or something explicitly criminal, he's not going to really mention the ceremony unless they ask him. So
I don't think they would redact the ceremony either. They might redact the names from it.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would think that they would redact the ceremony is maybe because they were a lot of those guys, maybe at the time this file was released, were still alive, and they were actively investigating those guys. And maybe they didn't want them to know that they were made or something. I don't know, but that's just total conjecture on my part. But, I could see the opposite being just as true, that he just didn't want to divulge that he was made in a ceremony.
Ask them. That's possible. Yeah, I mean, like, most of what they're interested in is they seem like they're interested in, being able, if they're going to flip him, if he can give them Joe Ferriola.
Yeah.
He's telling them, look, I didn't have any sit downs with Ferriola. I mean, he's been out of commission basically. His health is very bad. I haven't had any dealings with him. And then
in that case they had against Scarpelli, the FBI in the late 80s, before Scarpelli died, they said that was the single most important case that they were investigating against the Chicago outfit at the time, was the Scarpelli case. And I think that's in the belief that they could flip Scarpelli and get him in turn to flip on Ferriola, who at that time they believed to be the boss of the outfit. So you can understand why they think it was the most important case to the Chicago LCN investigation at the time.
Yeah, when really they were trying to flip a guy who at that point wasn't even made yet. Then afterwards, could give him very little. And Ferriola wasn't the boss and was also right about to die anyway,
Yeah.
If anything was delayed, he wouldn't have lived long enough anyway to, they wouldn't have had a trial. The guy was too sick,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I know. I guess that was all a moot point since they indicted that whole crew, or a lot of that crew a couple years later anyway. So
We'll get into that in the next episode.
Yeah, apparently Jehoda was able to give them enough information that they could go forth with an indictment. So
It's an entertaining case too, because we've had, we have some insight. Somebody wrote a book where they had a chapter about it, right? So
yeah, that chapter was a really great chapter, and gave us a lot of insight into the trial that you don't really have in some of the extant newspaper articles either. So
sort of human aspect of it, of the wives and the family and everything showing up. We get very little of that in Chicago. You get a ton of it.
I mean, Toots Torello's wife attended the trial, and Toots at that Turk Torello's wife attended the trial, and she had been and Turk had been dead 12 years by that point. So there was still a lot of involvement, at the social level at that point.
Well, I believe that Antoinette Giancana also attended that trial.
She did, yeah.
And denounced in front of the Dirksen Federal Building on the news, denounced the federal government as harassing Italians.
Yeah.
It's
interesting because the organization had killed her father, 15 years before that. So
that's what happens. And this is also, like, again, people seem to think that, like, the Chicago thing was sort of, I don't know, like it was run like a business, like it wasn't really, I don't know, a family or something. But I mean, it's bound up very closely with the community and family networks, right? And again, none of these guys, essentially, except for a very few small number of exceptions, maybe, when you look into the actual history and background of members and associates over the decades, none of them came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
They all come, they come from, in almost every case, from the same set of towns and networked, regional towns in Sicily and in the southern mainland of Italy. And, are over and over again related to past figures, whether members or associates, through blood or through marriage. Over and over. And this is true up to the names that you hear in the news in recent years. Over and over again. So that's a whole aspect of it, I feel, that is completely out of almost anything you'll ever read.
Yeah.
Essentially anything. Even family secrets, right? No insight into this, and this was absolutely an important dynamic,
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's 3 hours and 20 minutes. Hell, you could almost chop that up into 2 parts, and
not for us. Maybe
coming up, but
it could be like a little after.
Hey, listen, we're gonna do a 24-hour live stream. That's my goal.
Just us putting charts up on the wall and shit, and making coffee in the back.
We'll take live questions.
Okay.
Anybody watching? We'll just go ahead and just go live, Angelo. Anybody who's watching, let's just go live now. We'll take questions.
Yeah, I'll get some coffee.
We can finally answer people's angry accusations about ignoring Johnny Torrio.
That's the whole point of the show. We want to ignore the guys like Torrio. We want to do the opposite of what people want here.
Johnny Torrio made the National Crime Syndicate in 1920.
Well, we will talk about Torrio. We're saving that one for a rainy day because we got some interesting stuff to say.
Well, we do actually. Torrio's an interesting case. It's funny, his close associate testified against Capone in his tax case.
Now we're going into it. Now we're going to do a Torrio episode right now at this rate.
And then Capone from Alcatraz provided a statement against Torrio to be used in Torrio's later tax case in New York, which sort of adds to the idea that they didn't get along with each other by the time Torrio left Chicago.
Yeah,
it does. And the idea that Capone drove Torrio out.
Yeah. There's always the theory that he was behind Torrio's shooting too, right?
Well, you don't get to be where Capone got without being a very shrewd individual. We know that Gentile said that he was made on the pretext of killing his, by all accounts, his friend and ally Lombardo. And they were basically a faction fighting Joe Aiello, and different accounts exist as to whether or not it was actually Capone's guys that killed Lombardo. Gentile says it was, right? Law enforcement had a guy linked to Aiello killing him. We don't really know, right? But we know that he at least agreed to kill Lombardo, and Gentile believed he killed him. So, there's a lot of double dealing. Whatever his personal feelings would have been about it, he might have hated himself for the rest of his life. Who knows? But he did it, or he agreed to do it. the
You'll have to get Rick on me. I'd be useless. I'd be useless on that. You'd have to get Rick.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's yeah, no, it's getting back into the deep history of it, but I mean that stuff is sometimes it really pops up over and over again, you know, and it's interesting, but you know, like the whole Chicago Heights thing, I feel like you have to kind of give it context.
Yeah.
You know, this is a place that had maybe 3 families operating there at one point. Well, it did. I'm sure there was Chicago Heights, Gary, and Chicago itself probably had members all operating in that area, and you know, could have been 3 crews later. You know, and probably over time they all got truncated into one crew. There's no evidence after like the '60s really that there's more than one crew, right? Everything seems to point to the guys who are running Chicago Heights taking all the area and everything in Northwest Indiana, but we don't really know. And then by 1991, it's a couple of guys shaking down bookies in Gary. And Gary, by 1991, I've been to Gary in 1991 a bunch of times. I wouldn't. You have to. I wouldn't want to go there to shake somebody down. You have to shake me down to make me go there and shake somebody down.
You were going to say I wouldn't go there to shake someone's hand. Probably the same thing.
I got chased by a pack of wild dogs onto the Miller Beach Metro, you know, like the South Shore Electric train in Gary. You know, Gary is on the edge of Gary is the Indiana Dunes, which is a national park. It's a, you know, it's amazing. You know, if you ever look up pictures of it, it's really beautiful. That's right on the edge of Gary, though. And you know, yeah, one time I took a train out there when I was a kid in the '90s, and there was a commuter train that goes right into the Chicago Loop. And I got chased by a pack of wild dogs in broad daylight. So, have you ever seen a building cut in half diagonally? Like it looks like an enormous knife just cut it in half diagonally, like an apartment building.
It's like World War II.
Yeah.
Bombings.
A church that had been abandoned for I don't know how many decades, a couple blocks from the City Hall of Gary. The doors are open in the front. You can look inside, like the actual nave or whatever. The steeple had collapsed in on itself, and like the steeple of the church with the cross hanging upside down in the middle of like the nave of the church.
It's a metaphor for something.
Metaphor for Gary. So this is Gary in the '90s. So it's really bad. So yeah, it's unsurprising that these guys, you know, didn't have a lot of action. You know, all the money moved out to newer suburbs like Merrillville, and you know, I'm sure just it wasn't the same sort of environment. You know. All right. Well, thanks to the audience for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this and gotten something out of it. Again, we're going to do a follow-up episode discussing other crews and some other questions related to the post-Aiuppa Chicago outfit in an upcoming episode. And we have other episodes in the pipeline also. So stay tuned, and thank you for your support. Also, make sure to check out the Black Hand Forum for other up-to-date and historical information about the Mafia.